Good morning. I sneaked in. I didn't want to network um, because I didn't see anybody networking. Hopefully, we can begin this year to network more. Um, Mine is just to wish you a happy new year and to let you know that this year we will try to take this forum to another level. The first 7 sessions we have mostly been chatting, talking. We would continue with getting guests to come and talk to you, but we want to take it to another level. Some of those people that I've been working with closely, whom I've seen at what levels they are in terms of either commercialization or beginning to think about new enterprises. We want to see how we can get several mentors to take the talk to practice. So by the next month, when we have the other sessions, we would probably get some people to come and talk as to what has gone on or what they have benefited from this forum. But today, we have a wonderful speaker. You remember those who were here in November. The World Bank said they had an energy up challenge coming up. And World Bank is partnering with IBM. So we have a research scientist from IBM. His name is Taneja. And it's a PhD computer science from University of California, Berkeley, one of the world's top universities, and we're privileged to have him here to share with us. He's actually based here in Kenya at the iHub lab, such that if you have some problem, feel free to contact him as you go through. But first, we will listen to what he's doing. Then afterwards, we can get into questions. So, welcome, and karibu daktari. We say daktari in Kenya. That's such that anybody has a headache, you can prescribe, even if you're a computer scientist. Thank you.
Asante. Habari ya asubuhi. Thank you, Dr. Ndemo, for the nice introduction, and thank you to Jessica and the iHub as well for hosting me this morning. As Dr. Ndemo mentioned, I'm a research scientist at the IBM Research Lab. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's a multidisciplinary research lab that IBM has opened. I believe it's the first commercial IT research lab in sub-Saharan Africa. It's based at the Catholic University of Eastern Africa, so just on Langata Road near Galleria Mall. So we're nearby, and we're conducting research in a lot of different areas. Anything from, I'm an energy researcher, but we have a team in water, a team in healthcare, a team in education, a team in mobility, and a team in financial inclusion. So lots of different areas we're engaging with very many different ecosystems, whether it's government or startups or large companies or NGOs or academics. We're engaging in lots of different ways. So if you have any interesting ideas, or if you want to talk through some of your things, one thing we realize is that it's very important for us to kind of foster the innovation ecosystem that iHub is a very strong part of, and so we want to be very much involved in how things operate and help things along in that way. So great. The talk today I'm going to try, and so it's part of the World Bank Negawatt Challenge that Dr. Ndemo mentioned. It's essentially an apps challenge, or kind of a startup challenge for building companies, building new, exciting, vibrant companies, combining energy and information technology. And the goal is for Nairobi, looking at energy efficiency specifically, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. I wanted to get a sense for the audience today. So first I want to ask, how many of you guys have a computing background? Computing background. Okay. And how many of you guys have an energy background? Okay, and my next question is, how many of you guys use energy? Okay, good. So most everybody. Some of you folks don't, but that happens. It's cool. All right. So my talk today is going to be a little bit of background on energy to kind of bring us all to the same baseline of what we understand. And then after that, I'm going to talk a bit about experiences in entrepreneurship, observations I've made. I've been working in the energy space for about 7-8 years now, and lots of opportunities to kind of see what's happening in Silicon Valley, and a little bit more chance to be closer to what's happening here. I've been in Kenya for almost a year and a half, so getting a sense for things, but obviously you guys know a lot more about it than me. So one thing also is I very much want this to be interactive, so I'll be asking questions like that and asking you guys to pipe up at various points in time. So feel free to interrupt with a hand or whatever else. I don't have quite enough material to fill the 45 minutes, so I need you guys to help me out. Great. Can everybody hear me okay, even in the back? Sawa. Okay, so today I want to begin with a short little outline just to explain kind of what we're going to be discussing today. So there'll be a background on energy. I want to give a little idea about some of the terminology, things like that. I want to talk about electricity supply on the continent and where it comes from and how it's changing. There's some important trends that are happening that it's really important to be aware of what's happening in whatever industry you're studying. And so in research, we very much try to look forward. We try and kind of invent the future a little bit, but to invent the future, you have to understand where the future might actually be. And so it's really important to look at trends. And then last, I want to talk about energy entrepreneurship. So some of the opportunities, some of the examples, some of the pitfalls that tend to happen in energy as well as in other kinds of startups that I've been able to observe at least. Great, so energy, very, very important commodity. It's something that it's a critical input for society, for growth, but it's been said that the electricity grid is the most important scientific or engineering innovation of the 20th century. Now, to put a little more detail to that, this is a system that's distributed in different places across the entire world. You have no inventory in the system. It's all delivered just in time, and it manages to actually work in most cases. Not always. We had a big outage last night, but there are things like that that happen. But still, the electricity grid working and working as it has for the last 50 to 100 years in many places is a marvel, and it's been called the most important engineering achievement for the last century. But that's last century. What's happening this century? So energy as an industry is very kind of old, stodgy, slow-moving, and there's a lot of room for IT to disrupt that. Disruptive forces are very important. We've seen IT disrupt so many other industries, and now it's time for it to happen to energy as well. There's fits and starts of that happening already, but we want to see how IT can disrupt the electricity delivery system and energy delivery otherwise all across the world. So what's happening here on the continent? Well, we're in a time when there's enormous investment coming in. There's this Power Africa program from the USAID that's meant to kind of bootstrap a lot of other investment. I think they're shooting for something like 2 to 3 times what their investment is, and their investment is about $28 billion US dollars. So that's a big start, but there's also lots of other activities going on. The African Development Bank, the World Bank, and others are really pushing to help this. And then African governments are also starting to understand that infrastructure is very, very important, and that it's in many cases been ignored too much. So it's time to move along and be able to kind of bootstrap economies with these kinds of efforts. So what else is happening? Well, energy is always very closely interlinked with climate change, and so the discussion is often about how can we improve energy access but also maintain kind of low carbon systems. And that's a very, very difficult challenge, but we see that it's kind of happening in different ways. So it's a little bit difficult to say that coming from a place like the US, where we use 20% of the world's oil and we have 4% of the world's population. But then there's other places like China, like India, they're adding on average 4 coal plants a week, big giant coal plants. And so that's the kind of system we're dealing with, and it's going to be a very, very big challenge to be able to kind of grow, but not bake ourselves in the meantime. So I wanted to get us all discussing in the right kinds of ways when we're talking about energy. So there's some useful jargon, some terminology that's important to understand. I saw there a few of you were energy experts. We're probably going to not touch the level of your intellect on this one, but hopefully we can bring everybody to the same level. So there's energy and there's electricity. Energy is kind of any way in which we do work. But electricity is a more specific kind of it. And you see these two terms often used interchangeably, and it's not the way it should be done. Electricity is one specific kind of energy, and it's going to be the most important one going forward as we start to replace energy in other systems like transportation with electricity in many cases. So energy is a unit over time, so there's always a time component with energy. It's units of joules or kilowatt hours, and so the hours part on kilowatts is very important to notice. But then there's power, which is a kind of a delivery. It's a delivery at any point in time. There's current, which is kind of like a flow. It's in amps. And then there's voltage. Voltage is kind of like water pressure in some way. It's the amount that it can push through. And then frequency is essentially how quickly it's switching over. Electricity, in many cases, it works by kind of switching its polarity back and forth. And so the frequency is essentially how many times it's doing that in a second. And all of the grids here are roughly what's called 50 hertz. And so every second, it's going from positive to negative 50 times. And essentially the whole challenge with keeping a grid operating is keeping that frequency as close to the nominal 50 hertz as possible. So if you go off by 1%, that's actually when we get brownouts and blackouts. And so the grid operators are essentially trying to keep that frequency at 50 hertz the entire time the system is operating. So that alternating current, the switching back and forth, that's how most grid systems are developed, and that actually results from kind of the magnetic activity of motors. They're spinning around, there's magnets on both sides, and so you get this kind of oscillating frequency. So that's kind of the way grids have been built for the last 100 years, but what's changing now is actually an emergence of direct current for a lot of other applications. So direct current are, you keep a constant voltage, and things like batteries and computers and things like that are almost always on direct current. So all these little dorky boxes that we have to connect to our computers or whatever else, all that's doing is taking the AC from the wall, switching it to the DC so that our computers can use it. But as we're switching over to more and more DC, it's actually changing how people think about grids, because no longer are we necessarily worried about pushing AC, alternating current out everywhere. Now, since most things we actually use are in DC direct current, we might think about building a grid differently than we would have when we designed the grid in many places 100 years ago. And there's an interesting parable about this. So it's said that if Thomas Edison came today, if Alexander Graham Bell came back to life today and saw what we've done with his invention, what we've done with the telephone, he would be absolutely astounded. But if Thomas Edison were to come today and see what we've done with electricity, he'd be very comfortable. It's something that it hasn't changed in 100 years, and that's ripe for innovation. So you hear the terms renewable and non-renewable. This one's a little bit more intuitive. It's essentially a resource that can be kind of taken from the environment, but it also comes back. It comes back at a rate that is equal to or faster than the rate we take it. So things like wind and solar and so on, or even hydro when you do run-of-river hydro that allows the river to keep flowing, those things are renewable. They keep producing. Things that are non-renewable, it's like having a bunch of fuel in the ground, and when that fuel is out, you're done. So you have to be a little bit more careful. Fossil fuels are a big example of that. So we're kind of working on the wealth of the future by doing that. So this notion of energy efficiency and energy conservation. It's important to understand the difference here. Energy efficiency is about doing the same amount of work, getting the same amount of stuff done, but using less energy. So instead of, say, 10 kilowatt hours to keep your water heater at home warm, you can do it with 5 kilowatt hours and still get the same amount of actual warmth or what you need. Then there's energy conservation. Energy conservation is about actually reducing the amount of consumption, but also getting less out of it. So that's something like maybe you keep the temperature a little bit warmer and don't turn the AC on as much. And that way you're conserving energy, but you're also getting less out of it. You're actually keeping yourself warmer. And so it's important to kind of understand that difference when people talk about energy efficiency or talk about energy conservation. You hear a lot about the smart grid and then also the not so smart grid. So the smart grid is essentially, it's kind of a vision for the future, and it's coming along in steps. We're kind of at the very early part about it. But I'll talk more about how this differs and how the grid is changing. But the smart grid is essentially a big hype machine that everybody's very excited about. But we're on the path, and there's bits and pieces happening different places, but it's a long road. And I'll explain quite a bit more in the next slide about that. So a big part of this, the first kind of main step of the smart grid, is what's called advanced metering infrastructure, or smart meters. And what this essentially are, instead of having the old meter that the KPLC man would come, KPLC man or woman would come and read your meter every single month. In some places, they're installing a meter that is able to use wireless to transmit data back, sometimes on a very frequent basis, up to, say, every 15 minutes or so. And so they're able to kind of keep more track of what energy consumption habits are and better understand patterns of that consumption. And so this is kind of the first step in getting that smart meter out there. It's essentially that you want some intelligence to be present at the endpoints. Right now, a lot of grids are still in this kind of older paradigm where the only sensors and the only intelligence happens in the center of the grid. Maybe the substations are as far as things go, but at the operations center and a little bit further, that's where sensing happens. And then when it comes to anything on the edges of the grid, it's at homes or businesses or whatever else, the operators have no idea what's going on. They don't know there's an outage in many places until you call them. And so smart meters are starting to help alleviate that problem, but that's the first step in getting this kind of smart grid set up. So another big consideration, especially on the continent, is this world of on-grid versus off-grid. And on the continent, we have roughly 30% of the population, depending on what source you look at, has electricity. The other 70% doesn't. And so there's a huge percentage of the population that's off-grid. Now in Kenya, the Rural Electrification Authority has really spread the grid very far, but people aren't connecting. It's too expensive. So there are all sorts of different solutions you can come up with to try and help that transition from everybody being on the grid, for not so many people being on the grid, to everybody being on the grid. And that's an important part of actually my work at the IBM Research Lab. I'll talk not as much about that today. I'll talk more about what happens on the grid more than off-grid. So there's also a big difference, and this connects with the last point about urban versus rural. I have a couple of maps I'll show, but essentially the disparity in how many people have access to electricity is very, very big, and I can show you a bit about that. So what does the smart grid actually look like? Well, this is meant to kind of represent what the current grid actually looks like. You have generally what are called baseline and dispatchable large sources of generation. So you see a giant hydro plant there, you see a coal plant, whatever else. These are things that in many cases they're flat. They produce the same amount of electricity all day, and they're very, very expensive to turn off and turn on because they take a long time, and there's a lot of latent heat and things like that that make you really not want to turn these things off. Those are the baseline layers of electricity. And then there's dispatchable sources. So in general, the amount of electricity used during the middle of the day versus at nighttime can be anywhere from like 2 to 3 times in that area more in the daytime than at nighttime. So they have to have some kind of generation that they can turn on and off each and every single day in order to kind of meet that demand. And if they just keep things on, or if they just keep things off, we don't have enough power. If they just keep things on, then when there isn't enough demand to satisfy the amount of supply on the grid, that's when that frequency starts to move away from 50 hertz, and we get brownouts and blackouts and bad things happen on the grid. So that's what makes the KPLC man sad and the rest of us even sadder. So that's what's happening on the generation side, and there's generally a small amount of very large sources. Now on the demand side, all the things we use for electricity, they're pretty oblivious of what's going on. They're charging when they need, like it's a battery or something, there's a motor or there's a light that you turn on or whatever else, but they're not really worried about what's happening on the rest of the grid. And in many cases, that's been the paradigm for the last 100 years. But what's actually changing is that we're getting a new kind of electricity source that's popping up. So this kind of source is called a non-dispatchable source. It's something you can't turn on and off. things like solar, things like wind. These are things that when the sun shines, that's when we get electricity. When the wind blows, that's when we get electricity. And as you lose the ability to turn things on and off on the supply side, you now have a very much more difficult problem of maintaining the balance between supply and demand as people are turning things on and off, and as the demand is changing throughout the day and throughout the season. So this, as we get a larger proportion of solar and wind on the grid, managing the grid becomes a lot more difficult problem. So what I worked on quite a bit in graduate school, and what's changing a lot of this, is in order to keep that balance between supply and demand, when you have supply shifting on its own and demand shifting on its own, you actually need something. You could do it with energy storage. That would be great, but energy storage is way too expensive, and the amount of energy storage you would actually need is beyond anything we've ever deployed in the world. So it's not quite there yet. But if you had loads, things like refrigerators or air conditioners or things like that don't necessarily need to operate on a fixed schedule, they can kind of shift their schedule quite a bit. The refrigerator turns on for, say, 10 minutes every hour. But when that 10 minutes occurs, can actually shift quite a bit. If you can take advantage of that, then you can have all of the refrigerators kind of match when electricity is available and avoid when electricity isn't available. So it's a very windy, your fridge is going to be running. And so what does that take? That takes a lot of communication. It takes communication both ways. And so this is where you get this kind of IT-enabled internet world combining with the electricity world, so that by overlaying it, you can actually run systems more efficiently, and you can run systems that allow us to add more and more of these non-dispatchable, more solar, more wind to the grid. So what does electricity look like on grids right now? This is a picture of the last roughly 30, 35 years, 45 years of the Kenyan grid, and it's kind of the proportion of electrical generation that comes from different types of sources. So you see the blue. The blue is hydro. That's all of the big dams on the Tana River and everywhere else in Kenya. And then the black is what's essentially diesel plants. And these were built, in many cases, a lot of them were built in response to droughts and things like that. You can actually see here in, I think it was around 2001 or 1999, around then. And then again in 2007, 2008, there were some droughts. And so you went from a system that had a lot of hydro to very little hydro, and you needed to fix that with diesel. And at those points in time, and still now, there wasn't a lot of oil coming out of the ground in Kenya. So that's really expensive to have happen. So they're trying to figure out how best to avoid this. This green on the top is actually what's emerging. This is the geothermal that's happening from Olkaria up near Hell's Gate in Naivasha. And so they're taking the superheated water from the ground and using it to run turbines, and you've got geothermal energy. Since we're on a tectonic boundary, plates, there's lots of great heat. Kenya has the best geothermal resource on the continent, and has been developed for quite a long time. You can actually see that we've been getting geothermal energy here for the whole time here, 30, 40 years even. But it's even growing as well. And so you hear a lot now about the government's plan to improve or to increase capacity by 5,000 megawatts. And the way that's actually going to happen is to kind of split this up, grow the geothermal. The hydro's not changing that much. And then add a couple of layers, add some hydro coming from Ethiopia, add some wind coming from Lake Turkana, and then also add there's in the plans of natural gas and coal. I'm a little bit more dubious about that. If you want to talk more about it afterwards, I'm happy to talk. But this is a changing picture. Though one thing I do want to point out with this, the changes are slow. Energy is a very slow-moving industry. We don't think on the notion of, in energy, it's not generally on the notion of years, it's on the notion of decades and eras. And so we are now entering the era of natural gas. Natural gas is coming from the ground, it's very, very cheap. This is a big wholesale shift that's happening across the world. But it's important to kind of realize that the internet mindset of, get that app out there, deploy it, iterate on it a few times and change it and so on, doesn't meld very well with the energy mindset of 10, 20, 30-year investment cycles and kind of slow-moving and very risk-averse and so on. So it's a meeting and clashing of minds there, which has been interesting to watch. Another example here is Nigeria. Nigeria uses primarily, there's less of a hydro resource there. The blue is hydro. They use less oil, surprisingly, on their electricity grid. The gray is actually natural gas. So Now they're using quite a bit of natural gas, and this is actually what's happening in a lot of countries. Natural gas is replacing a lot of the other fossil fuel sources. In many cases, coal is being displaced by natural gas in a lot of big markets. And so as it continues to be cheap and changes people's mindsets on that 20, 30-year investment plan, you're going to see a lot more countries that have a grid like this. Kenya is actually blessed with having a lot of renewable generation. And in fact, if we're able to pull in that hydro, and if demand actually ends up being not what the government predicts, but what a lot of scientists predict, Kenya could actually be 100% renewable in the next 5 years. And it's actually pretty impressive. Pretty lucky place to have that kind of mix of resources. So I talked earlier about urban versus rural electrification. These are two different pictures that really show this in stark contrast. The maps kind of show 5 different buckets from 0 to 20% in red, all the way to 80 to 100% of the population having access to electricity in green. The map on the left is for rural electrification in each of the countries, and the map on the right is for urban electrification. You see a very different picture in the two places. Here, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa has less than 20%, and in general, it's generally about 5 to 8%. On this data set, it's all a reporting issue, but it's still very, very low, of people have access to electricity in rural areas. In urban places, it's generally averages about 70%. There's a few outliers and so on, but it's quite a bit different picture. And obviously, the help with having density, a lot of people in a small place means you can provide people more electricity, or you can provide people electricity more cheaply in dense places like cities. But this is something that has to change. This is something that is a huge drag on economies. It's a huge drag on people's lives. You can really improve a person's life just by giving them that first kilowatt hour of energy. Just for the light, or starting to add the cell phone charging, or whatever else, makes a huge difference in a person's life. And so how do we get this picture to look more like this picture? That's a big part of what we're studying at the lab. I won't focus on it much today, but it's important to kind of understand the state of how things are today. One of the big things that's driving this picture is actually very high grid connection costs. In Kenya, you've seen it go from, used to be in the 15,000, 20,000 bob range, now went up to 35,000. And then for a while, they were talking about going up to 70,000, 75,000. It's in massive amounts of debate, whatever else. That's too much for the Monanchi. It's just, in a rural area, you can't afford 75,000 bob for an electricity connection, so people aren't paying it. And the lives are suffering, and we need to find a way to be able to improve that access to electricity. So there's lots of things popping up that can do that, and I'll discuss those in turn. So what does the ecosystem look like here, the industry? And this is a chart from somebody at the Kenya Power Lighting Company. So I'll focus on a few things here. This has been a largely deregulated system. So it used to be that electricity utilities were all kind of one big, massive monolith. It was one company that did generation and transmission and then distribution to customers. They did all the planning, they did all the siting, everything else on their own. But that doesn't necessarily work for actually providing electricity to people, because they don't have as much interest in improving their systems then. The metrics aren't set well and so on. So a lot of countries have started to deregulate. Kenya is sort of on the leading front for the continent for trying to split these entities up and introduce some amount of competition to improve this. And so what we see here, we have the customers on the bottom. You have KPLC is the only utility at this point, and so they're the ones who are kind of dealing with all of the customers. But now you have kind of an independent transmission authority that operates the lines that distribute electricity around the country. And then up here is where you have more deregulation. You have, instead of KenGen operating all of the generation, now there's somewhere around 60% of the capacity. And so you have a lot of independent power producers that can sign a long-term power purchase agreement, a contract with KPLC, and say, hey, we'll give you this kind of electricity at this cost for 20 years. And they work out these kind of big contracts. And you have a few other things going on. In 2006, REA, the Rural Electrification Authority, was established because it was seen that problem of not getting connections out there was even worse than it is now. And so REA has worked very hard and actually done very, very well relative to where we were in 2006 to improve the spread of the grid. They still have problems in getting those connections out there, but they're working on it. And this is a largely better picture than what's happening in a lot of other countries. They're still working on getting their electrification out there, but Kenya is in much better shape in many ways. So what are some of these trends that I discussed? What are the big things that are happening in the world in energy that it's important to understand just to see where things are going? Because if you know where things are going, or if you can predict pretty well where things are going, you can be ahead of the curve when you're starting a business or even building a business or whatever you're doing, whether you're doing research or whatever else. It's good to keep an eye on the future if you can. So one big thing is that I talked about is that natural gas generation is becoming bigger across the world, and renewables are too. Renewables generally, the cost is coming down because policies are encouraging requirements to have renewables as part of the generation mix. But as you get more and more out there, the prices come down because of economies of scale. And so that's starting to emerge now that in some places renewables are actually on par cost-wise with fossil fuel sources of generation. But natural gas coming down so far in price is actually really throwing the utility guys for a loop. Next one is that you have demand-side resources starting to show up. So these are the things I talked about earlier, those loads that you can start shifting and change their consumption patterns to match what's going on the grid. And what do you need to do that? You need a lot of IT. And so that's why IBM is interested in this. That's why it makes sense for innovation like at the iHub or wherever else to be interested about this, is because you have this melding of this old industry that needs a lot of disruption with IT, and there's lots of opportunities there to do that in different ways in different countries. You have huge fluctuations in oil prices right now. I think we're somewhere around $60 a barrel right now. 40, 50, wow. You don't follow the news for a week or two and things change quite a bit. So we're up over 100 last year. And so those massive changes, it's very difficult to predict where it's going. And so it's difficult to do kind of investments on a longer scale, whether it's at renewables or whether you should be running your grid off of oil because it's so cheap. Who knows? And so that makes it difficult to do planning in this space. There's big investments happening into more generation, but again, more generation isn't helping the person upcountry get access to electricity. The amount of electricity they need is very, very small. So the more generation is useful for building an industrial base and manufacturing and things like that, but they're fooling you if they're talking only about generation and not talking about connections. That's the important thing that I want to say here. Grids aren't expanding quickly enough. That's exactly the same point, is that we're not improving access for people. Solar is actually a big force that might have the potential to really improve that access. This is the cost of solar panels has come down 5-fold in the last 5 years, something like that. I might have my numbers a little bit off, but it's that order of magnitude, that it's a very, very massive change in the industry. And that means that whereas somebody who wanted energy out in the village could have used diesel way back, now they can actually throw a little solar panel on their house, charge their phone, maybe have a small radio, and have a little light or two, and improve their business or just improve home life or whatever else at a cost that's actually somewhat approachable to their budget. And so this is really starting to change. You see a lot of startups in this space, Kenya, elsewhere in Africa, and so on. So there's a lot of opportunities there. These are these solar home systems, and sometimes they convert it to AC so we can use all the appliances we have here that have those dorky boxes, and sometimes they just skip the grid, and this is where it's really interesting. They don't have to worry about converting to AC. They keep things in DC, so they can charge computers directly, and they can charge cell phones directly. You don't necessarily need the special plug for it or whatever else. And so this is a pretty massive change in that you might have these kind of islands of DC that aren't connected to the grid, and so it's important to kind of think about what the future of the African electricity system looks like. You have batteries starting to become affordable, and that's actually replacing diesel as kind of a way to ensure reliability of energy. The price is coming down not as fast as solar or other things, but it's becoming more approachable for a lot of applications that are off the grid. And then you have things like microgrids popping up, where you have a small number of customers. Maybe it's 10 to 100, maybe it's up to even 1,000 customers that are, again, on an island, connected only to each other, not connected to the main grid, but these distributed forms of electricity, solar and wind and biomass and micro hydro and things like that, can enable this to actually work. So I want to move on to a chart that is, it elicits a lot of thinking. And I'll let you guys form some conclusions first. But what we see here is 2000 to 2012. We have the delivery of services for sub-Saharan Africa. So on the y-axis, we have the percent of population that has access to these different services. So at the bottom here in this light blue, we have landlines. Here in red, we have energy, electricity. Here in gray, we have access to sanitation. Here in yellow, we have access to water. And blue, of course, the one that cuts across all of them is mobile. Big story, you guys might have heard, but people like mobile phones. And so, well, you can quibble about the definitions and the actual numbers, but it's fairly flat when you're talking about all of these other ones. And then you have mobile, which is really changing the story. Why is that? Why is that doing that? And then you don't see the proximate conditions for energy to do the same thing. Why can't it jump and get that same exponential type growth? Well, there's things about infrastructure and how it gets installed. There's things about competition. Mobile, once you started to deregulate competition, it made sense for a company to go out there and start deploying towers and start reaching those new customers. So as the cost of distributed electricity comes down and the emergence of different regulatory schemes to allow businesses to form in the area of providing electricity to people, who knows, we might get a situation where electricity can start to show some kind of growth that looks like this. And that's what we're trying to enable at IBM. That's what I work on. But as an industry, it's something that we can work towards. I just think that this chart in general it really gets the point across that we have a very, very different world when we're talking about different technologies. Great, so hopefully you guys are now all energy experts. We're all ready to talk at a very deep level about the energy industry. Are there any questions that anybody has from any of the material I've shown thus far? All right, well, feel free to interrupt. It's totally cool at any point. So I want to talk more now about why you came here, about entrepreneurship in energy or entrepreneurship in general. Some of the things I've seen from kind of watching different companies grow and shrink and fail and not fail. Yes?
Probably, I think explain the basis of what megawatt, the definition of megawatt.
Sure.
People think megawatt is a code name, but it actually means something in energy.
Absolutely. So that's a great question. So this World Bank Challenge is called the Negawatt Challenge. And I mentioned the difference earlier between energy efficiency and energy conservation. So it's said that energy efficiency is the cheapest way to add capacity to the grid. Rather than building a giant coal plant, you can cut a lot of electricity and you get the same result because now you have some of your supply freed up in order to provide electricity to people. And you can do that way more cheaply than it takes to build all the materials and import all the coal, and you're not paying for that kind of consistent investment of fuel. And so negawatts, so a lot of big generation facilities are measured by their capacity in megawatts. Megawatts are 1 million watts each. And so a coal plant can be anywhere from like 500 to 1,000 megawatts. So a negawatt is actually the unit of energy efficiency. It's how you get those reductions in electricity. And so negawatt is actually not a code name. It's a mixture of negative and watt. So you're essentially able to kind of cut your power in order to kind of free up some of that capacity for other purposes. So it's way cheaper than adding capacity. And that's what the World Bank App Challenge is focused on, is trying to find those opportunities for energy efficiency, particularly in urban areas. And the Negawatt Challenge is actually, it's a competition in some ways that they're looking at 4 or 5 different cities across the world. There's one in Brazil, one here in Kenya, Accra, and then I think there was a city, it used to be in India, but I think they changed it a bit. So I'm not sure where the fourth city is. But Nairobi needs to win this. So how do we prove that we can put our best minds forward to cutting electricity here? And then at the end of the day, it brings all our bills down as well, all of the electricity bills. It makes it cheaper. So how do we take advantage of that? Great question, Jessica. Thank you.
Another question.
Sure.
I like the graph that you showed of the comparison between. Thanks, Mugethi. I like the graph that you showed of that the access to services of sub-Saharan Africa. If you see the exponential growth of mobile, and you just see a very constant, a very small change over like a 10-year decade on electricity, right? It makes sense when you look at this as a researcher, and it would explain a lot of things, but my curiosity is to like the young innovators in the room, is like there's a lot happening in energy right now, how can we apply the same approach of like the disruptive, guerrilla, frugal kind of innovation that's happened in mobile in the electricity trends? Like you showed a lot of trends. Like is it on the demand side? Is it creating more apps? Is it infrastructure? What are the opportunities right there? And probably you're going to highlight that, but
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. So she's asking about what are the ingredients you need to actually cause this sort of disruptive change? What can innovators do? Where are the opportunities? And I'll be talking quite a bit about that. But this is the very, very short answer is if you can't beat them, join them. This is caused by having business models that are repeatable and scalable. And I'll explain a bit more about that going forward. So
thank you for your presentation, even though you're not done. But I was wondering, what is the potential impact of biofuel? I've had a lot of talk of sugar companies wanting to supply power.
Sure.
As well.
So the question was about biofuel and what are its impacts. And so biofuel is essentially when you take biological materials that are waste products, in many cases from often from crops is a good source. So sugar companies and maize growers and things like that, and use those waste products. You burn them and you produce some kind of energy out of it, whether it's directly heating or it could be electricity. And so there are lots of opportunities in this. One big thing to note about energy is that there's no such thing as a silver bullet. There's no one solution that gets things across. It's almost always going to be a portfolio when you start looking at a country scale. Now, what's cheapest in different areas? Maybe in Kakamega, you have Mumias there, you have tons of great sugar resource. You have lots of the extra parts of the cane, and that's very energy dense. You can burn that. But at coast, you don't have those same resources, so it doesn't make sense to do biofuels. So it's really important to kind of consider what's nearby when you think about how you produce energy. Biofuels are getting better. They work really well in a lot of places. What Kenya's really, really done well when it comes to innovating in this space is, to get back to Jessica's question a little bit, if you run a small grid, a small microgrid, if you don't have a cheap way to do collections and to do billing in any way, you can't run it, because the cost of doing all the collections, the cost of potential problems in getting payments, things like that, are far beyond what it takes to actually operate it, and it makes the whole venture not work out. But by having things like M-Pesa or other mobile money services, you can actually really reduce the cost of what it takes to do collections in that case. And so there are companies, there's a company called PowerHive that's doing a deployment of microgrids in Kisi. 100 different microgrids. They're working with solar, but there are other companies that are looking at doing small grids with biomass and also biogas, where you use livestock excreta to produce energy. So there's lots of opportunities there. If you want to talk more offline later, we can talk about specifics, but it's really important that the key point to get out of that is that there's lots of different possible ways to provide electricity, and it's probably going to take all of them to build a functioning and efficient system. Great, so let's talk more about entrepreneurship. I want to bring up first a definition. This is from Steve Blank. He's a professor at Stanford, and he teaches a lot of entrepreneurship classes. Yeah, question? Sure, no problem. If the microphone takes too long to get back there in general, I can repeat the question so that I can help that.
I wanted to ask if there's an opportunity for entrepreneurs. Like, America has nuclear energy, right? And we've been seeing from various journalists that nuclear waste is an emerging problem in America. So, like, if you could, what are they doing to solve that problem, or if we could offer some solutions to that problem?
Sure, it's a great question. So the question was about nuclear and how to deal with streams of nuclear waste. Nuclear is a very tough one. So in the current situation, you can't generally get funding for a nuclear power plant from any private source. No bank is going to fund that because the risk is essentially infinite. The cost of a meltdown no private entity can bear that. And even though it's a very, very small potential, the risk is beyond what's reasonable for banks. And so the only time we get nuclear deployments is if government is willing to back that. And government has kind of this infinite pool of risk that they can handle if they see that it's in the public's interest. So that's why in the US they didn't start, since the 70s they haven't built any nuclear plants. They just recently started building again, but that's a 30-year lag. And in other places it's similar kinds of problems. Things like Fukushima, the big problem they had in Japan with a reactor that was near the coast in a tsunami, that scares the hell out of people. And so, rightly so, because it just melts down an entire town or an entire region. So how do we deal with that waste? Well, there is room for innovation in that, but it's generally, it's not a logistics problem. It's much more a science and deep chemistry and things like that kind of issue. So IT doesn't really help there. It might be able to help in being able to kind of test a lot of different solutions or a lot of different ways to help break down that waste. I haven't seen a lot of work in that area. It's mostly been more around how do you do chemical processing of that waste in order to make it that you can do something with that waste that it's not harmful to people. Right now, they pretty much just bury it in the ground and hope it doesn't come to bite them later. So not a great space from a small entrepreneur's perspective, but it'll be interesting to see how innovation in that space can really unlock that, because otherwise nuclear is fairly clean. It doesn't produce any emissions, but the risk is the thing that really breaks it, the private risk, that they just can't handle it. Does that sort of answer your question? Great, thank you. Sure, please.
Thank you. One of the challenges you mentioned at the beginning with the electricity operators is the challenge of being able to, having to distribute or to sell the product as it's being generated. Is there any hope for, in the foreseeable future, for some technology that will allow the storage of electricity?
Sure, so we see the question was about electricity storage, and is there hope to help fix the inventory problem of the electricity grid from it being produced immediately and then having to be distributed immediately. So storage would be a silver bullet. I said there were no silver bullets in energy. It would be a silver bullet. It's just too expensive. And it's not just a little bit too expensive, it's it's order of magnitude too expensive. So the way storage is popping up now, you're starting to see situations where it's being used to operate the grid on the grid for only very small spikes when they need to cover a quick increase in load or maybe a quick drop in wind generation or something else, being able to fill that little void with storage. But the storage operator charges the grid a whole lot of money to be able to use their storage for that purpose. And so to give a little sense for the problem here, if you took all of the batteries, I know a little bit more about the US because that's where I spent a lot of time. If you took all of the batteries in cars, in computers, in cell phones, all of those, the capacity of all of them, you could run the grid in the US for about 20 minutes. So we're not really close to being at that scale of how we can get storage involved in the system at a kind of a deep level. There's a few applications where it's showing up, but storage is actually, it's limited scientifically by the conversion. It's a chemical reaction that's happening there. And so it doesn't improve at the same scale that, say, something like IT does. It doesn't obey those same laws. And so it's improving at a small number of % per year. That doesn't quite catch up to that order of magnitude. So it will have applications. It just won't be the thing that saves us from being able to add a lot of renewables and deal with the fluctuations. Does that answer your question? Great, thank you. So I want to start with the definition. Oh, we have another question here. Please.
Maybe we are.
It's
a burning question. Okay.
Yeah, these are good questions. I'm okay with it.
Thank you very much. My question is concerning the culture. Because in Africa, most of us, how do you deal with the culture in terms of access to solar? Because some of these technology innovations are from outside the Africa's continent. So culture, I think, is also one of the things that matters. For example, I'm working on a project to do with biogas. So you find like most of the farmers trying to convince them to work with the cow dung is sometimes a problem. So how do you address that issue when it comes to renewable energy?
Sure, it's a question about culture and having technologies that are appropriate for matching what people's needs and interests are here on the continent. So the question about, it was specifically about biogas, specifically around cow dung. In many cases, you do have cultural boundaries, and that makes things problems. So how do you deal with that? Well, in many cases, money talks. If you can convince somebody that if they're willing to change their behavior and save 30, 50, 70% of their energy costs by using a product that they were already producing anyway, it gets across. However, there are certain cultural boundaries you can't cross, and that's actually what's really important about being here, to understand those, being part of and getting to know your customer, understanding what their needs are, what their fears are, what their interests are, what their boundaries are. So part of us opening a lab, part of IBM opening a lab in Nairobi was so that not only can we work alongside Kenyans to understand how things think, it's important for me to be immersed in this environment. I've been here for 18 months. I'm starting to pick up a little bit to understand how people think about energy and other things in their daily life. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, about competitive advantages. That's knowing and understanding your customer in that way is something that is critical to getting your business working. And so you can, if it's a cultural boundary that is unbreakable, don't try to. But if it's something where you think that money can do the trick, and in fact, often social relationships and seeing somebody else making a lot of money by doing something like that, selling their dung to a biogas or burning it for biogas, and they see their neighbor do that, they might get interested too. So you just need to be able to break in small ways, but money talks in many cases.
Can you expound? I mean, they're fearing to touch cow dung, or because this culture thing is.
Yeah, sometimes it comes with the responsibilities when it comes to maintaining the digester.
Yeah.
So you find like some of these roles, like sometimes women are left to do the work, and maybe you find like maybe men are not really doing it. Again, when it comes to energy such as solar, sometimes I've seen many projects that have been launched in Kenya whereby people are using solar cooking stoves. You find like traditionally Africans are used to the three stone technology. So you find that some of these models are not working in Africa. So I also think it's very important for you to highlight
that is room for innovation.
Exactly, and this is
That's
actually what I want to talk about here.
Yeah, okay.
So to think about that a little bit more, what's a startup? So this is a definition from Steve Blank, but essentially a startup is an organization that's built to explore business models, to find what's a scalable and repeatable business model. A startup isn't a company of any other, like any other. It's meant for exploration. So the idea you start with, 99 times out of pretty much 99, you're not going to end up with the same business model you initially thought of. You might not even end up with the same product. You might not end up in the same industry. You might be doing something entirely different. Who knows? But that said, the startup is the organization that helps you figure out that business model, learn more about your customers, learn more about your product, learn more about your capabilities in order to find that design that is both scalable, repeatable, and scalable. So repeatable means you can do it again and again and again. Scalable means it gets easier as you grow it. It doesn't get harder. So something that wouldn't be scalable is, let's say you need people to go clean the biogas digesters and kind of cruise all around the country to do that. Well, it doesn't necessarily scale well because as you grow in space, you need quite a bit more people to be able to cover all that space. And so it doesn't scale well. Things like software. Software historically scales very well because you build it once, and then everybody can use it. The same thing again and again and again and again. So that's inherently very scalable. A lot of the internet, a lot of the buzz around Silicon Valley and all the startups is really about developing and designing business models that are both repeatable and scalable. And so this is sort of the mindset you can think about when kind of designing how your company can operate, is figuring out how to make it both of these two things. Might have lost power here, or Nope. Okay. And then the other one is a quote from Winston Churchill, and it's about success. And this is another important part about entrepreneurship that's worth mentioning, is that success consists of going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. And this is a bit of a cultural thing as well. Surprisingly, one of the things that makes the US very good at entrepreneurship is willingness to fail. The guy who's failed the most times might be the one you trust the most, because he's kind of, he knows what the problems have been each time. The person who's not willing to fail, well, they're also not willing to take the risks to succeed. And in many spaces like we're in, it is going to be risky. You're going to maybe have to work for nothing for a while, even though you could be at a cushy job at IBM or something like that, to be making money. So maybe I'm not the right person to be talking about this right now, but they also say make your mistakes on somebody else's dime, so who knows. So that said, important to think about how failure fits into this, and you have to be willing to fail in order to be able to succeed. So I want to kind of walk through an example of searching for a business model so that you guys can get a sense for what this process might be like. So this is an innovation that we're discussing at the lab right now, and I probably shouldn't have put these things on slides and showed them all to you, but I figured I'd be friendly and share something we're up to because it's exciting, and I want to hear what you guys have to say. So we have a big problem in Nairobi, elsewhere in other cities across the continent, with electricity outages. They happen different places, different times, different seasons, different durations. They're often either somewhat predicted by the utility turning things off, or they're unpredictable. Maybe there's a fault on a 220 kilovolt line from here to Olkaria, like what happened yesterday. But the system is kind of the set of outages is varying in time, varying in space, and varying over seasons. And it's caused by all kinds of things: shortages, weather, operations mistakes. There's any number of reasons these things happen. So how do we improve on that? How do we make the delivery of electricity better? And who can we sell that idea to? Well, one step would be predicting outages. But predicting outages is actually very, very difficult because there's all kinds of reasons that go into it. And you'd have to have a lot of sensors to really be able to do that very, very well. But combining a lot of different data sources, maybe taking things like data from Twitter. So this is actually a chart over the hours of the day of people complaining about KPLC, essentially. And you see there aren't a lot of complaints at night. That's not because there aren't necessarily outages. It might be because people are sleeping, right? But there's a bunch of data in social media that we generate that might be useful to understand where, when outages are occurring. There's power meter data that's being generated. So some of the larger customers in KPLC already have smart meters, and so you could use those data to help drive this. There's a design with mobile phone chargers that I'm going to discuss in the next couple of slides. And then there's data from the grid itself, whether it's reservoir levels, because we're a very hydro-driven grid, or whether it's other power data that's moving throughout the grid. We can use these things in tandem to help try and figure out where, when, and for how long outages are occurring. So what could we do with something like this? Well, we could guide utility upgrades. We could help them figure out where the problems are occurring right when they happen so that the durations of outages are shorter. We can help them do proactive maintenance instead of reactive repair. And we could also inform consumers of outages. So we could tell somebody, oh, you're at high risk for an outage right now, so make sure you don't start something that needs to run for a long time, or whatever else. So it'd be great if we could solve this problem, right? How are we going to do it?
There are months in Kenya where there is a preference of outages. You can actually, on the long term, you can predict. If you are able to predict weather patterns in Kenya, you can predict the outages. I mean, if you know there is going to be drought and the water levels would be down, you can actually predict that month we would have several outages. You may not know the precise dates, but you can tell.
Absolutely. So the point was that we can predict outages on a further basis by looking at weather patterns. So you saw the chart earlier that in the drought years, 98, 99, and 2007, 2008, when the grid switched from being mostly hydro to mostly diesel. Diesel's expensive, so they didn't want to pay for it, and so they do rolling blackouts, things like that, and there's more outages. So you can predict it on a longer term, but on a shorter term, it's a much more difficult problem. And so how can we use data to help improve that? So I want to walk through this as a business model with you guys. So in order to do this, I mentioned mobile phone chargers earlier. One thing that we've developed in collaboration with a couple of universities is a way to use smartphones to detect where, when, and how long an outage is. And so the way that very, very basically the way it works is if a phone is plugged in and charging and it loses its power, if you can tell whether that's losing its power because somebody physically unplugged it or if it's because the power went out from the wall, then you know if it's an outage or not. And so it only works for phones that are charging. But what's really nice about it is that it can be an app running in the background of a person's phone they already have. And so it essentially provides kind of a very basic level smart meter, or some of the functions of a smart meter, as a background app on a phone. So pretty cool, but it's got its limitations. So so it uses GPS for localization. It uses some sensors to figure out if it's if somebody's physically disconnecting it or if it's the power going out. What might be some of the problems with an app like this working for Kenya? Don't need to raise your hand, just blurt it out. Go ahead.
You probably don't spend most of your time plugged in.
Absolutely, right? That's one. Any other problems anybody can think of? How many people in here have smartphones? Okay, it's going to be a much higher percentage here than it is in a lot of places, right? We're innovative people here, but there's a lot of places where people don't necessarily have smartphones, and so how would you get any kind of coverage in those neighborhoods? Important things to think about. So what might a business model be for something like this? So we're going to walk through a few different business models and kind of think about how we might go about selling this technology, making it useful, building a business out of it. So easiest one, selling data to utilities. Advantages there, it's the simplest possible model. We talked a lot about the benefits to utilities. The utility is interested in reducing their operations costs because they can, again, replace costly repair with cheaper maintenance. And they also can improve the services for their customers. They can improve their operations. And I'm pretty sure KPLC is interested in that most of the time. And so that's something that they'd be very interested in. So what are some of the open questions there? Why would this not necessarily work? And this is an important step to understand that you can believe in your startup, but you should always be skeptical. You should always try and ask the hard questions. You should also solicit the hard questions from other people. Try and figure out what about your model might not work. So questions here. We talked about the coverage. So smartphones aren't necessarily everywhere. Another couple questions might be something about how do you get the software out there? How are you going to get your customers or your end users who aren't your customers to get interested in this? What's in it for them? Why would they install this app on their phone? And then how does that kind of scale? So there's that question of scalability. It's nice because it's software, but if there's no carrot for them, if there's no either financial benefit or other benefit to them in order to install this, you're going to be stuck. So what might another business model be? Well, you could take all of these data, put them together, and get predictions of where there might be outage risk, where you're at a higher potential of losing power in the very near future, in the short term. And you could sell that directly to consumers. So some people might be very interested in that. So it's using the same data, the same kinds of things to kind of sell a product. So nice pros there. You have a lot of different customers. So there's going to be a lot of different types of people you can sell to. There's benefits from network effects. If you get one customer involved, more people will see it, just like the biogas problem. Their neighbors will see it and say, hey, why don't I have that? That would be great to have, and they're willing to pay for it. With utilities, there's often very few per country. Kenya has one, Tanzania has one, Rwanda has one, so on. And so you've got one shot at it. Here you have a lot of shots. Could it be, there's also some open questions here. What kinds of customers? Is it residential customers? There's a lot more of those customers, but they're of lower value when it comes to selling something. There's industrial customers, there's commercial customers. Who's right for this kind of thing? How do you explore that space? Are the predictions actually useful? Will people pay for that? Is that something that people are really after? Not clear, and it's important to kind of ask yourself these hard questions. Why couldn't I just use an existing product? If I'm a smart meter, why would I use this product instead of, or if I'm an industrial customer, why would I use this product instead of a smart meter, which costs a little bit more, but I get more benefits out of it? So it's really important to understand where your product fits in the competitive landscape. Let's think of another business model. And there's many more than the three I have on this slide, but at least it helps you kind of see what the range might be. You could sell these predictions to telephone companies, to tower companies, tower operators. So the benefits there are you have enormous consumers of energy. In many cases, depending on the price of diesel, this can be 40–50% of their operating expenditures are spent on that diesel. Maybe not now with the huge reduction in costs, and that's important to think about, but it's a huge part of the expenses for running these towers in far-flung areas that don't have access to electricity grid. And in fact, you could partner with these companies to sell the same data back to the utilities because they install it in all their towers, and now the utility could use those data to actually do the same things we talked about in the first business model. So you kind of get some advantage of both, though you have to split the proceeds with the tower company. But it might be a useful angle there. So what are some of the open questions here? Well, they might already have outage data. You know, they monitor their towers. They might be doing some kind of optimization already in place by trying to reduce their diesel by doing some predictions or pushing load to other towers or other things. Not really sure, so you really have to understand how they're operating these towers now. Could you do this sort of thing or provide that partnership to the utility just by using software with their existing systems? That's a potential model as well, and so you might not even be using the thing that you developed if you understand that the business opportunity is another one, if the model is somewhat different. And so how would you do maintenance? Now here you're dealing with a big company. They would want you to come with a solution and also be able to maintain it for them. Well, that's a different story. That might not be as scalable because these towers are in far-flung places and it takes 2 days to get to Turkana by road. So how is that going to work?
Actually, monetization of the second proposal is much easier. Because right now, Kenya Power does not read the meters. They just give you a bill. If you begin to provide the customers with the actual bills and telling them that what you are paying is mambo jumbo from Kenya Power, you would actually begin to revolutionize the entire billing system of Kenya Power.
It's a great point, and that's actually a pretty big opportunity. So a slide or two down the road, I'll talk about some examples of startups that are already in this space, and they're doing things that are very similar to this with some other cool technology. So it's a great point. You guys are doing a good job leading me along here. Great. So this was meant to kind of show how much you sell this product, and there's a bunch more exploration that might come from doing user studies, from going out there, meeting your customers, getting to know them better, figuring out what other ways you can alter your technology to be advantageous. A lot of benefits here to like going through the process and exploring those business models to find the one or the set that are scalable and repeatable. So I talked about this smartphone application, but we could think about a companion application that runs on a feature phone. Now this helps us in a lot of ways because we can expand the scope of where we can deploy. I mentioned this earlier. The downsides of, say, doing something like this on a feature phone is that you don't necessarily have a set location that you can use. You can use maybe cell tower localization, but that only gets you within, say, a half a kilometer or a kilometer of where you are, which isn't necessarily great. And the other thing is that you can't do this in the background on a feature phone. So it would have to be a dedicated device that's kind of plugged in without a battery and just sitting in someone's home or sitting in a business. Potential for tampering, other things like that. But you could introduce it after doing your smartphone deployment and then figuring out where the holes in your observation are and saying we need to deploy a feature phone here, there, or whatever. And again, you're getting a lot of the features of a smart meter, but at a much, much lower cost. And so kind of thinking through other ways you can accomplish the same thing using other devices is another way to kind of alter your business model design. And so this is another thing we're thinking about. We haven't built it yet, but again, it's important to think about what the options that this opens are and how scalable and repeatable they are. Cool. So I think going through that discussion, one of the things I wanted to get to is what are some of the common pitfalls that happen, and what are some of the mistakes people make when doing entrepreneurship in these sorts of areas? And these are mostly from observation. They're probably all debatable in different ways, but I've seen them all show up in different ways at different times. So biggest first one, not understanding your customers, not getting out there, not knowing what their interests are, if you were selling biogas digesters and you weren't in the field and you see nobody's buying these digesters, why not? Is it too expensive? You'd probably have the wrong result because you don't know that your customer doesn't like dealing with the cow dung. And that's something you need to absolutely understand your customer, whether it's doing surveys or doing beta releases or whatever else. Critical, 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 know your customer. Also not understanding your competition. And I see this happen a lot in the solar space here. You have all of these different solar companies popping up, and they're really secretive and they hate each other and they're doing whatever. They're not each other's competition. Their competition is all of the KPLC guys, or in many cases the kerosene that people use for lighting or whatever else. That's their competition. If they spend so much time worrying about this little chunk of the market that's already buying solar, they're losing out on the big picture of the 99% of people that are buying kerosene to do lighting. And so that's really important to understand. What's that? Okay. So that's another important observation, is really know who your competitors are and don't lose sight of that as you grow. Next one is about not understanding competitive advantages. And the biggest one I want to talk about here, competitive advantage, is where you have some kind of skill or some kind of access that is a sort of barrier against other people doing the same thing you're doing. And so this culture one is actually really important. A company from the UK coming and deploying solar panels here doesn't understand the Kenyan market, doesn't understand Kenyan culture nearly as well as you all do. You live it, you know it. And that's a key thing to take advantage of, is really understand cultural nuances that are different here from other places, and really say, why wouldn't that product that shows up in another country, why wouldn't that work here? What is the advantage I have, and is that something that is defensible, or is it something that they can learn very easily, adapt their system, and then you're done? So it's worthwhile to understand which competitive advantages you have and how defensible are they? How well can they do at protecting your business and allowing your business to grow at a rate that is different from the other guys? So really here it's a question of taking advantage of the things that you're really good at. Now I want to say that when it comes to innovation, there's a lot of programmers out here. I'm sure you guys are great programmers. Many of the computer folks out here are, but there's a lot of programmers out there. So that in and of itself is not a differentiating enough factor. Really understanding your customers, understanding your problems, and understanding cultures is something that you can use to provide this difference. Next is really taking too long to test an idea. So this is something that's going to be a little bit difficult with energy because of the longer cycles, but in many cases it's build something, get it out there, test it, get that response back, and fold it into your product. It should really be a very tight and kind of quick and agile cycle in that way. And also, when you do tests like that, when you do alpha tests, when you do beta tests, measure everything, whether it's quantitative, like how they use the application, or qualitative, comments or things like that. Measure everything, because the insights that could be the thing that break open your business model might be there, and you have to find them. So make sure you measure everything. Yes?
I like that you said measure, because it's a reiteration of learn, measure, evaluate, right? Mm-hmm. But for a lot of the young entrepreneurs here, when you say measure is a very ambiguous word. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
So I touched on this a little bit. The point was that measure is a very ambiguous word, and it's true. I touched on it in that measuring means generating data, but data come in a lot of different formats. They can be quantitative, things like the number of times people interact and how they interact with a device, or statistics for maybe how payments are going, or all of those numbers that show up in different places. You want to grab every single one of those. But qualitative is actually very important as well. Hearing people's thoughts, opinions, especially when you're doing smaller scale, qualitative can be way more valuable than quantitative. So it's important to understand anecdotes, people telling their story, not necessarily so that you can draw large conclusions from one anecdote. If there's traffic on Mombasa Road today, maybe there's traffic on Mombasa Road every day, but it's hard to draw that conclusion with just the one little bit of data about the one day, though we know there is traffic on Mombasa Road every day. So it's really important to understand what the value of your data are, but measuring just means capturing it all so that you can think about it later, so that you can pit it against other tests you do so that you can try and draw insights from it when you have more time, not when you're in the heat of doing a deployment or a test or whatever else, but capturing everything you can, because you never know when the critical insight is going to hit you, and so you'd love to capture everything you can at each possible stage. And yes, it takes more effort to get that deployed, but it's way more valuable if you have it than if you don't. Does that answer your question, Jessica? Great, thank you. So the next one is focusing on the wrong opportunities. So there's part of the background, the context I gave on energy is to really understand where the big problems are. You could build an app that gets people to turn off their lights in their house, but people's houses aren't where a lot of the electricity consumption is. In Kenya, it's about 60% of electricity is consumed in industry. And so you're focusing on the wrong problem. Lighting is getting better. There's CFLs out there. There's going to be LED lights quite a bit more, things like that. So if you're getting people to turn off their lights, it's laudable. You're getting people to save energy, but it's not the big opportunity. You're focusing on the wrong thing. And so it's really important to ask yourself what the relevance of what you're doing is. And also, if you have to be careful that the impact of what you're doing is actually big enough to convince people to use your thing, whatever your thing is. If it's going to be a small thing and it's not very valuable to people, even if it's a huge problem, it might not, if people aren't willing to deploy it, you might not be able to get that activation energy so that they actually go out and download your app or buy your little device or whatever it is. And so that's an important consideration when picking the problem that you're trying to solve. Next is about devices. So we have a question here? Yes, please.
On the too little impact or too small of a problem, in Kenya, I think one of the most, how can I say, top problems is that people fear high projects because they have high risk. Mm-hmm. How do you get to stop that?
There's a little bit about it. You can either try and stop it, or you can understand it and build your business otherwise. That's another cultural consideration, is how much risk people are willing to take on. Behavior change works sometimes, but generally it's very difficult. Expecting people to change their behavior based on your thing is often a losing cause. Now, I know I said differently earlier when we were talking about the biogas, but money can change behavior because people like money. But other things, it's actually very difficult to change behavior. And so when it comes to, say, electricity and consumption patterns, it's pretty difficult to change people's behavior in those ways because, yes, people connect electricity consumption with cost and how much it costs to get that kilowatt hour, but people aren't, say, turning on and off their lights too much with the consideration of cost. And so very kind of difficult to get people to change their behaviors about big costs up front and then owning something versus paying a little bit as pay as you go. And so a lot of business models, especially say in the solar home system space where people are buying these small solar panels for their homes, they've really adapted. A lot of that has just been exploration of business models, and now almost every single company is you can't buy the whole thing up front. You have to buy, pay 50 bob per day or pay some amount per week or whatever else. And so in that case, instead of trying to change people's minds, they went to where the people were. People were used to paying for kerosene on a regular basis. And instead of that, now they're just paying for solar light on a regular basis. So it's a little bit about adapting your business model to fit culture, much more often that than the other way around. So the next one is about devices. And it's becoming more popular to think about the Internet of Things and small sensors and whatever else. But there's a lot of challenges here. There's challenges in manufacturing, maintenance of actual devices. If you get 1,000 people to install your device and then it breaks down in a week, who's going to fix those things? How's that going to work? You have to think about these things when you're designing your business model, and that's a huge risk with doing your own devices. Often a big enough risk that devices can be a kind of dangerous way for a small company to fail at a business model. And yes, failure is okay, but that's an expensive failure. You kind of want cheaper failures than that generally. And then cost, devices, they'll come down in time, but in many cases you want to be able to piggyback off of devices that people might already have. The cell phone in their pocket is the easiest one because it's an amazing computing device that may have sensors, it has a communication ability. As long as you can convince the person that that's the platform that they can use to install your thing, that's a much more scalable, much more repeatable business model. And it's just one you cannot ignore. But otherwise, special devices that are particularly for a purpose for your startup, be very, very, very wary. It's not as easy as you think. Crowdsourcing is another one. So something like MA3 route. So there you're getting lots of people to tweet or do a web form or whatever to send information about traffic. That one works because a lot of people get benefit from sending in those tweets. You get to kind of see what traffic looks like all around the city. But you have to be very careful when doing crowdsourcing to really understand incentives. How do you get enough data to start with, bootstrap, so that you have enough data that is useful to begin with and people will start adding to the system? And how do you convince people to continue to add to the system? In the energy space, for example, you could design the same outage monitoring application where people just text or tweet to you directly. But what's their incentive to do that? What do they get out of it? And in many cases, crowdsourcing is a very, very exciting idea that fails 95% of the time. There's so many countless apps out there of crowdsourced kinds of things that just don't have a user base because the incentive patterns weren't figured out. This is the key thing with crowdsourcing to figure out. And then also data quality is very important. Are they going to lie to you? Are they going to send you the right things? Are they going to send it at the right time? Not clear. So it's important to really incentivize that in some way. Just a couple more slides, I think. Hopefully this is useful for folks. Next one is about partners. Depending on partners can be difficult. Getting those relationships right so that they have the same motivations you do and aligning those things is challenging. And at some point, maybe your partner becomes your competitor. So how do you kind of manage that transition? How do you become powerful enough that you have the competitive advantage to do the thing you're doing and they don't? But then again, they have a competitive advantage in some other area. And so it can be risky and it can be a little bit more difficult to get the business model right. But then again, as small entrepreneurs or whatever else, we don't have the scale that partners, large companies or large or government or whomever else has. So we do need them in many ways, but it's risky and it's important to be cognizant of that risk going in, knowing that, all right, if these guys don't come up with what they said they'll come up with, I'm sunk. And so understanding that that's a risk to your business model is actually very, very important. And it should affect how you build it. If you can avoid it in many cases, you probably should. So the summary here is essentially the old line about trust but verify, except added a couple words here that trust your intuition, but verify that it's relevant and it can scale. So you have to really think deeply about your business model, ask questions, throw it out there. That's a lot of networking could be, if you have a company you're starting, you should be getting that elevator pitch ready so that you can talk to people whose opinions you trust, even people's opinions you don't trust, just to be gathering those kinds of data. This is about measurement of perceptions in this case. So some examples of different companies that have popped up in different places doing energy entrepreneurship. The first one is two companies, one in Ukraine and one in Brazil. And these guys are both involved with the Negawatt Challenge. And they're doing what Dr. Ndemo explained earlier, which is, in fact, they've put on a small sensor on the main line from the utility. And this small sensor is able to, without breaking into the circuit, measure the magnetic effect from the current flowing through the wire and be able to estimate what the power draw is to a fairly accurate level for the entire unit. So like, let's say you live in a flat, it could get your entire flat's power consumption just by tacking this onto the outside. Now what they're also doing that's really cool is software that looks at kind of level changes again and again and again, where say somebody turns the lights on. Now this thing doesn't know that that's what's happening, but over time it sees that there is a load that when people turn it on, it goes from 50 watts to 120 watts, or maybe 300 watts to 370 watts, or whatever else. It's that 70 watt load that shows up again and again and again. And if you do this enough and you have enough cool machine learning stuff in there, you can actually figure out what all the different loads are and be able to say when they're turning on. With a small amount of information, you could get from having one little sensor to an entire picture of what all of your consumption is. And then using that picture, they can provide recommendations for how you might save power, how you might be more efficient with your energy. And so that both this ecois.me and Green Ant in Ukraine and in Brazil are operating on the same business model. You see it popping up in different places. And so it's one that makes a lot of sense, and that's why it's popping up in different places. Another one is Opower. Opower is a company in the US that they don't put the sensor on your meter because they actually work with utility and use their smart meter to provide the same data. And so then they're taking those smart meter data, which is essentially the same thing as what these guys are doing, but without the sensor installed, and using that to provide recommendations. They're able to cut 10, 15, even sometimes 20, 25% of people's power bills off just by providing recommendations. Because people do like money, and so they're willing to save if you tell them how to. Then, I've talked mostly about electricity here, and I want to be very clear that electricity is the area I'm more passionate about and the thing I understand more in energy, but there's a whole wide range of energy beyond electricity and fuels and transportation and other kinds of things. So Automatic, this is a company that it was started maybe a couple years ago, and what they essentially do, in every car, there's a port that you can plug into. It's generally, say, under the driver's seat or so, that provides diagnostic information about the car. And so a lot of more modern cars, for repairs, the repairman has, or repairwoman, has a computer that they can plug in to this port called the OBD2 port. To get diagnostics about how the system is operating. Maybe it's like air versus fuel levels in the engine, or it's driver habits of gas and brake and so on. All of these things that are diagnostics about the car. Well, they're using this port with it for a different reason. They're plugging a little device in there that has a Bluetooth connection to a person's smartphone. The device is kind of logging, and whenever the smartphone shows up, it passes those data back, and they're passing that information to the user to improve their acceleration and their braking habits. Now you could think about putting this on a matatu, or you could put it on a private car or whatever else, and you could provide, say, feedback to the owner of the Sacco or whatever else. There's lots of different ways you could kind of use this same idea for startups here if you can align the interests right. So with the matatu, it's a very fraught one because you have owners, you have conductors, you have the fare collectors, you have the passengers. They all have their own interests, whatever else. But there's an idea in there that might work. And so these guys are using it to help people's acceleration and braking habits. Then this last one here is actually a startup of some friends of mine that were in my graduate group, and it's called Building Robotics. What they're essentially doing is a lot of buildings have what are called building management systems, a lot of like modern commercial type buildings. I'm sure the Bishmagwa building has it too, that connects to all of the sensors, all of the heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems throughout the building. Now often these systems are kind of what we call stovepipes. They connect to each other and they don't connect to anything else. And what these guys are doing is breaking into that. So it's getting a little bit warm in here right now, for example. If you were sitting in the back working on something and it was getting warm, what could you do to fix that? Not very much. What these guys are doing is building a software-only solution that allows you to say, I'm too hot or I'm too cold. And it detects where you are, and it changes the heating system, and it learns your habits over time, and it learns everybody else's habits over time to make it as comfortable for you as possible and also save energy. So there's a lot of cool machine learning under the covers, things like that. But there's a big advantage. Office buildings are generally fairly uncomfortable for people, and not just because it's saving energy. Sometimes they're too cold. They're blasting the AC all the time. And why would you do that? But using a little bit of information technology, you can really improve on that system. And in the case of these guys, they're just connecting existing hardware systems, existing sensors, with a little bit of IT to make it work, a little bit of software. So there's lots of different kinds of business models that come up. This is just a small sample, but I want you to get a sense that, and each of these guys didn't start doing these things, I'm sure. They kind of explored and found their way to them to find the thing that's scalable and repeatable. Is there a question?
I wanted to say that the automatic, where is the car improving? Acceleration and braking.
Yeah.
In this country, most of the vehicles are stick shift. And actually you sit, and most people don't know the relation between energy consumption and changing of the gears. And people have cars with fifth gear, but they never go beyond the fourth gear, and they end up spending so much energy. Could a sensor help where I say, please change your gear to fifth gear?
Absolutely, and in fact, that sensor already exists on the cars. I mean, this OBD2 port connects to all of the sensors. The data you can be getting from this, it's really rich data. There are sensor networks on the road everywhere. These cars have incredible suites of sensors about acceleration, about braking, about fuel and air mixes, about all of the seat belts and things like that. Those things are heavily instrumented, and so a little bit of software can detect what gear you're in, how much fuel you're burning at any point in time, and learn your habits over time so that it can tell you, hey, you should probably change your gear because you can save, 1,000 bob this month if you just learn to use fifth gear all the time. So things like that, there are opportunities here. And so it's a great observation, but what's different here is that the cultural observation of knowing how people drive is not something that you can do from the outside. That's the kind of innovation that needs to happen here, and it's a potential model to explore. Another question?
Not a question. I just wanted to add that we already have a bit of that here in Kenya, especially with commercial vehicles for fleet management and vehicles financed through banks, because those are required to be fitted with tracking devices.
Sure.
And a lot of those tracking devices tell you if the driver is braking too hard, or it also gives you information on fuel consumption.
Right.
So I think some of that is already in use in the country.
Sure, absolutely. And so the comment was essentially that some of the same capabilities are showing up, but for different markets. It's not necessarily for private consumers, but for businesses and things like that. And it could be you change the sensor suite. If you use, say, a mobile phone and use the GPS capability on that, you might not have the resolution to see how quickly or slowly a person's braking necessarily. You might add on an accelerometer or a gyroscope or something into that device. So there's kind of a sliding scale of how complex your device is, how easily available it is. Can you reuse hardware that's coming off the shelf from somewhere? And so, for example, this OBD2 sensor that Automatic uses, you can get one by itself for $15 US. And so if you start buying in scale, you can really bring that price down. It's cheaper than a phone. And so there's always a sliding scale between cost of inputs and what insight you get out of it. The tracking devices can give you kind of external view of the car because they provide like a location, a continuous set of locations, but this OBD2 device plugging into the car's port has a lot more wealth of information. For example, another service that Automatic offers is that if you get in an accident, they can immediately connect to the police, or if you want that, or a hospital or something else. They can really go to that connection immediately. So there's all sorts of different innovations that can come from having those kinds of data where you wouldn't necessarily know that somebody got in an accident if you just had a tracking device. You'd think they just might be stopped at in a jam or something like that. So the last one I want to talk about, this is the last slide. I know it's getting warm and you guys have sat with me patiently for a long time. We'll save questions for after this, is Nest. So Nest is a company that's popped up. It was started by some of the guys who designed the iPod. And they got into the energy space because they noticed that thermostats are ugly and perform terribly. And so what they've designed is an iPod-like thermostat. This is a device that you can set the temperature on. It has a motion sensor, so it learns when you're kind of at home, when you move around, what your habits are. It learns your preferences of what kind of temperature you like, where you set it, what times of day, things like that. And not only that, it has a communication ability, so it's reporting these data up into the cloud. And so what they can do is they can take lessons learned from the millions of thermostats they've now deployed, and use that to be more efficient with your electricity, when to kind of predict when you're going to come home, whatever else. This is the epitome of big data and energy coming together. And so you get improved performance, you get improved comfort. It's a kind of a win in many different ways. And so you can kind of combine these things to really get something innovative. And in fact, it's so innovative that about a year ago, Google bought Nest for $3.2 billion. $1 billion. So there's the big thing they wanted there is they now get data about all of these customers and their movement habits and their interests and their things like that they weren't getting before. So the data are more valuable than the device to them, which is an interesting one. But I think the big takeaway here is that energy and IT startups, they have real value. There's potential out there for big, big, big things to happen. And that's the note I want to end on. So I wanted to say thanks, and I'm around for any kinds of questions you guys have. This is my email address. Feel free to contact me, and it's been a pleasure to be here with you guys today.
I sort of have an idea. If we can do it,
Absolutely.
Nobody should steal this from here. Can we make a public service vehicle black box where it monitors the speeds, how they brake, how they use the gears? After some time, we can predict from those who make accidents whether there is a relationship such that if such a driver gets on the driver's seat, there is an SMS to the passengers. As this guy is only a matter of time before the accident. So, any questions for Jay? Oh, la la. 1, 2, 3, from there. At the center here. Oops. You start from here and then going back.
And, I think Dr. Bitange has addressed the concern. Actually, what I'm really concerned is, do we have any local IT energy initiatives that we can borrow from? Because majority of us here are maybe students, and we are, especially on my side, I'm working on a startup with an organization back at where I stay at Kikuyu Town. So another question that I want to put in is on the issue of partners. How do you identify these partners? Especially most of us youth, we lack mentors, business mentors who can guide someone to work on a particular startups. We have so many ideas that we can work on, but we lack the mentors. So I'm really concerned on the local startups that we can work on, because sometimes it becomes a challenge to work on very big things.
That's a great question. So I was asking about the ecosystem for startups, especially in energy, and finding the right kinds of partners and so on. This is the perfect venue to ask that question. So Negawatt is actually trying to fill that niche. It's meant to be, this is the first of a series of Negawatt events, meetups, there's a boot camp event, there's kind of business model testing events, things like that. Things like that. And the hope is to kind of build that community, to pull in advisors. I'm going to be involved with this. Jessica is going to marshal other resources, and the other folks from the World Bank, the leaders of the program, are going to marshal other resources to provide exactly the things that you're talking about. Advice for business opportunities, ways to kind of test your business models, ways to kind of discuss through technology ideas or other ideas you might have, their viability, who might be an appropriate partner, how to set up those relationships, things like that. That's a big part of what Negawatt's for. And I also want to say a plug for the research lab here is that we really want to be built into the startup ecosystem here. And so you can email me, and I have I know everybody at the lab. We work in 6 primary research areas: mobility, energy, water, financial inclusion, education, and healthcare. So those 6 areas we have experts on that, we'd love to talk through ideas with you. We'd love to, partner. We have resources. We have computing resources. We have all kinds of coding resources. We've been hiring tons and tons and tons of developers, different things like that, that have gone from being interns at the lab to being full-time employees now. So we've also worked with startups to kind of help bootstrap their operations, and we've hosted services, things like that. So between Negawatt, between the IBM lab, there's resources out there that we need to be able to figure out how to connect these things, and also some of the plans Dr. Ndemo has this year for this Entrepreneurs Forum.
We actually plan to bring in most analog professors. They understand how the problem, to define the problem, so that you can be able to code the problem. This is one thing I said that we are going to do it differently. If you need help, from IBM to some people who can think through the problem and articulate the problem even before you begin to solve, to provide the solution. And that is what we can offer from our side. IBM has offered, World Bank has come in. You have it all. Next.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Kelvin. Mine is a simple question. We welcome all these devices and all this new technology, but to face it in a real way, this is Kenya, and I coming from a legal background, I'm aware that some laws in Kenya are the 1963 laws. So maybe we are unable to adapt to the new technology. And just to give you an example, away maybe from these, the drones, that there are some people who make drones, and these drones were able to detect poachers who kill maybe elephants, but they were unable to use these drones because there are no laws governing these drones. So how are you able to deal with these hiccups from the legal side?
Great point. So I think the question centers on policy and regulations and how they feed into encouraging and discouraging certain kinds of innovations. So that's another part of culture and of how change happens that's important to look at. So when you think about the future and what the environment will be 6 months down the road, 1 year down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, it's important to think about where those things are going. So if you take mobile money, there wasn't regulation around mobile money either, but Safaricom, having connections to the government, said, we're going to deploy this thing. And it got big enough that then the regulations were written so that it fit what M-Pesa was and what M-Pesa needed. So there's ways to do that. In many cases, the things are generally under-regulated here, so there are opportunities to break that. But on the other hand, as small entrepreneurs, as startups, you don't wield a lot of power to change policy, to change regulation. And that's got to be part of the calculus of what areas you decide to work in, what things you're working on, whether they need changes in policy, whether you can start one way and then when change of policy comes along, because there's enough pressure on government to actually cause that to happen, be ready to go the other way if that constraint is lifted from you. So it's important to do a little bit of projection and a little bit of kind of pragmatic, reality, looking at, okay, what's the situation now and is that going to change? Not really sure. So as somebody operating in business, you need to understand a little bit about policy and how it can completely sink you. And if it's something that you don't see changing, if there's some policies that aren't going to, it's not likely that they loosen and help the business you want to build, it's probably not the right business in the right place. Check other places, check other businesses.
Actually,
important to consider.
Don't ask for laws if they are not there. Things work better in this country where there is no legal framework. I mean, I will tell you.
Yeah, they say it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Don't call it a drone. Just say we had some toys which could find. I'm a living example here, by the way, on not breaking the law but working around the law. On M-Pesa, we did it. On the undersea cable, we did it. So unless you get someone who wants to be chopped on the neck, that is risk-taking at the policy level, you will never do it. But if you do it and show that we are catching the people, they would say, but we have a solution. There are some toys which catch this, and the law would be made. You would work best. If you are a lawyer, I'm sorry, just... Insurance worked best in this country when there was no regulatory framework. When it came, we are in a mess. Next question.
My question was on Jay, in your experience, having observed the energy generation and distribution in this country, what would you attribute the frequent brownouts and the blackouts to? Is it the generation or distribution? And if it is distribution, would you recommend that we have a different company that does distribution of electricity in this country as opposed to KPLC?
It's a good question. So there's a couple of elements there. One, which is what are the causes of outages? And I've seen some data about this. I'd be happy to share it if somebody wants to contact me. But in many developing countries, outages are often caused by a mismatch between supply and demand. Here in Kenya, it's not just a mismatch between supply and demand. It's actually, thanks. It's also has to do with faults in the system. It has to do with operational kinds of things. So when it comes to distribution, the risk you take is if you make it competitive, it's not to the public's benefit to have two parallel lines from different companies because it's very expensive to put those wires in. And so if you have, say, all around Nairobi, 2 sets of wires going into every building, that's not going to be good for the roads. It's not going to be good for the people. It's going to make things more expensive. So there's benefits to having one kind of monopoly operator when it comes to infrastructure, things like that. But there are ways to deregulate on the actual customer handling side, where instead of just having one KPLC that isn't as motivated to respond to their customers' concerns, if you can use the same set of lines but buy from Zuku Power or some other company that is offering the same power over the same lines, but maybe doing it with a slightly different business model, there might be room there for competition. But that's, again, a regulatory challenge and probably not one that's going to change. So it's hard to bank on that. But there are ways to innovate around this, and certain regions and states and countries and so on have the policies in place to kind of allow that kind of deregulation at the customer level. But again, this is a little bit of projection to think what's likely to happen, what's pragmatic. If you want to work on faults, you have to do it in a way that benefits KPLC, saves them money, or is innovative in a way that allows them to shine above other countries or other utilities in the region, or other ways that they want to shine. So it's really important to get inside the heads of the folks at KPLC to really understand what they're looking to do. And if you want to talk more about this offline, I've talked to many of those folks. I have I'd like to think a good sense of what they're thinking, what their concerns, what their challenges are. So my email's up here. Feel free to contact me.
Hi, Jay. For a lot of entrepreneurs, we have a concern where when you develop a product or when you have a great idea and you're looking for partners or mentors, in this country, there's a fear that you might give your idea to someone, share it, and they'll take it and run with it. And you as an entrepreneur without the capital take it to the next level. How do you protect yourself against that?
Absolutely. Big consideration is intellectual property and who holds your idea and how defensible it is. Part of that is about competitive advantages. So you have to be a little bit careful about that, but then again, if an idea is something that somebody else can replicate, if it's like, oh, I'm going to open a chip stall on Kingara Road because there's no chip stalls on Kingara Road, well, that's not going to help you that much because somebody else can do that pretty easily, so your idea isn't very defensible. So it's a combination of finding the right idea that has a competitive advantage that somebody else can't do without writing the code you've written or not sharing the little secrets you've kind of embedded in there. And So it's a little bit, you have to be careful about which problems you're solving and how the things you built or what access you might have or what kind of systems you've built are actually a competitive advantage for you. And generally, if it's something that isn't a competitive advantage for you, it's not going to be a good long-term business. And that's an important consideration. People often fall in love with their first idea, and you have to be willing to admit that it's a failure of an idea and move on to the next one. Does that answer your question? So, yeah. No, I want to say a little bit more about intellectual property and what it takes to like go to IBM or go to Safaricom and all these people, or World Bank running all these app challenges, things like that. You know, an idea takes a lot to get from a seed in your head to a deployed system. Yes, you might get scooped if the seed in your head is simple enough, but if you get a little further along and you build something, you know, quickly and start to test it, you might be far enough ahead that somebody can't catch up with you. And if that could be your competitive advantage, is the first mover advantage, if you get far enough along. So that's worth considering, but also having people you can trust is pretty important as well. People that have interest in seeing you succeed, like Dr. Ndemo or myself, but aren't going to get into the same areas as you because you know, I'm not looking to, I do research, I'm not looking to get into a startup on mobility or things like that. So it's important to kind of understand people's interests and motivations when you go talk to them as well. Hopefully that answers your question a little better. Thank you.
Mine is, I think you've touched on it. I think you've just touched a bit on it. It's on the fact that even though we come up with creative ideas and all that, we still have to sell them to Kenya Power, who may not be willing to take it up, because from your chart, from the utilities chart, the mobile chart, the mobile graph grew because, not because it was, basically it grew because of the privatization bit, whereby the mobile sector is run by either Safaricom or Airtel. I think this is a question which Dr. Bitange would best answer. What are the chances that energy will be privatized in this country, whereby we'll have, as you said, Zuku Power or someone else's power? Because then it will be easy to go to the rural areas whereby they don't have to pay for the power lines to come to them. Mm-hmm. The guys will go and put the power lines, then look for clients.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's about essentially how, if electricity is so driven by the one utility, how can you succeed without having to partner with that one utility? So there's 2 points I want to bring up here. One was about walking through those business models earlier, the 3 possible business models for the outage prediction or outage identification application on the phone. 2 of those didn't sell directly to Kenya Power, and it's still a startup in the innovation space. Yes, one of them could have been a follow-up product with selling to Kenya Power, but that's part of the idea about figuring out scalability and repeatability, is saying, okay, who are my customers, and how likely are they to, am I to be able to find other customers like them? How repeatable is it? And then, you know, how much risk am I taking on by working with those customers? So that's, there's a lot of ways to sell the same thing, because there's a lot of ways to explore business models. So that's one element of it. The other question is, and we're actually running a workshop on this in about 4 or 5 months. It's a question of, what does the future of electricity delivery look like on the continent? So Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is somewhere in the 1 to 1.2 billion person range. India is in the somewhere like 1.2 billion person range. Sub-Saharan Africa is at least 10 times bigger than India in land area. So you have a very sparsely spread out population. That's a huge driver to why electrification is so low. But with distributed generation, you have a lot of companies coming up that are providing electricity to you know, far-flung areas out in western or up in central, or you know, even further out to Costa, or, say to Tibet or whatever else. So you have lots of small companies popping up that are filling that space. And lo and behold, there isn't great regulation in how off-grid electricity can be provided. And so maybe, just maybe, some companies come up and end up writing that regulation themselves when they get big enough and, break the rules that aren't in place. And so by doing things like that, that is a huge market for competition, for innovation, new ideas. The best ideas can bubble to the top, and you're not married to the single utility that's at this point in time only serving 30% of the population in Kenya, but you're able to kind of approach the problems of that 70% who could be potentially a very lucrative business opportunity for you down the road. We have questions here, back there.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. It was just more of a question of your opinion if you've been talking to KPLC, and I think it will probably be of interest to a lot of people here because I feel it's an area which is going to have a lot of scope for innovation. But so KPLC have officially a feed-in tariff and are hoping to implement a net metering system which will where users can use the grid effectively as storage. It's like a bank where you'll deposit energy and can get it back. But I know that a lot of people are very skeptical about this. For example, the feed-in tariff is in place, but I don't think there's anything happening there. And net metering is meant to happen next year, but we don't know. So in your opinion, for people who have maybe got ideas feeding into that, what do you think the likelihood of that happening is going to be?
Sure, it's a great question. So the question was about feed-in tariffs and net metering and other policies that are relevant to KPLC that are actually in flux. So feed-in tariffs, to give a little background, is where you have a generation system that you put down as like an independent power producer, and by feeding that electricity to the grid, they give you money back. And the rate of that tariff is actually very important to the policy, whether it encourages businesses to, or small businesses, or whomever else to put in this generation kind of all spread out throughout the grid. And based on the size of it, sometimes you'll have lots of companies that are doing this, but if it's small, paltry, it doesn't cover the costs enough. And net metering, as the question explained, was about being able to put, say, a solar panel on your roof, and let's say you, in the middle of the day, are providing 10 units of power and you're only using 5, then that extra 5 units of power runs your meter backwards. So even though your 5 units, you weren't using them, they run your meter backwards, and then at the night when you consume 5 and your solar isn't providing you power anymore, you end up even. So that's the net part of the net metering. So it's not in place yet in Kenya. It's in place in a lot of other countries. Net metering is one that I'll say, from my opinion, not bullish going forward. And the reason I'm not bullish is because the utility business model and the slow-moving business model of not getting involved in rooftop solar, it's mostly been policy leading it, and there's tons and tons and tons of companies that are even financing you to get a solar panel on your roof in a lot of different locales all across the world. That's breaking utilities. The utility business model is ripping at the seams, because now the time when they were spending a lot of money to but also being able to charge people more for their electricity in the middle of the day is being offset by people's solar panels. And so where they had built their systems with 20, 30-year investment cycles to buy this infrastructure, they're no longer using that, and it's changing very, very quickly. It's breaking the business models for a lot of utilities. The ones that aren't adapting are starting to see some serious potential for financial ruin, because they've got these large assets, these large generation stations that might be stranded. They might be out there and not getting used, and it's brutal for their business model. So between those two, I have seen a few companies pop up with plans to put in generation and use the feed-in tariff. I want to say it's something like 9-ish shillings here in Kenya for the feed-in tariff, but that's up to 10 megawatts of power. So there's a very kind of narrow band of what kind of generation works, but there are companies that are operating in that space. When it comes to net metering, I wouldn't base a business on it. My personal opinion, even though this whole thing has been my opinion for the most part. but there's some data too. It's real, somebody else's opinions. So, that's one of those things where you have to project what the future might look like, and it's important to understand what things you can base truth on, what things you can't. When it comes to market forces, things like mobile growing and things like solar becoming cheaper, those are a lot easier to base yourself on than a single change in policy. Answer your question? Great, thank you. Got one here in the back.
Thank you, Jay. My name is Marcel. I'm based in Arusha, Tanzania. I work in a university. And you mentioned quite a few things that I'm working in a business idea with 3 students at Jomo Kenyatta University. I think they're not here because they're in finals, so they might be busy with that. But you mentioned smart grid, you mentioned smart meter, rural electrification, renewable energy, microgrids, and DC power. So what we're trying to work on is in DC microgrids in rural areas. And I want to know your opinion in that, because it's what I call the high-hanging fruit, because the low-hanging fruit is close to the grid. We're looking at the farthest place, and there's not that many appliances that are DC, so there's some challenges, but we think that it could have potential and benefit people. So I want to know from IBM research, is there some work in that direction of DC microgrids? And I would also like more competition in that area, because I haven't seen enough. Also collaborators from this room. Thank you.
Absolutely. So Marcel, thanks. We should definitely talk more, because this is the area I'm very passionate about, the thing I work on the most. And so DC microgrids, this is small grids that are islanded off the rest of the system that are generally doing things like lighting and cell phones, and at the kind of more extreme level, starting to get into TVs. But at the first basic uses are just getting those first kilowatt hours of electricity. So I'm bullish because, again, it's market forces. The cost of providing this generation is coming down. Now, regulation plays a very large part in this. There are certain countries that have regulations that say anybody providing electricity has to provide it at the same price as the grid. Non-starter for any kind of distributed electrification. It doesn't make sense to deploy it, and it doesn't grow unless you deploy it and you're able to charge what it actually costs you, or cost you plus whatever profit you need to make the business work. So one thing we're working on is actually trying to figure out where those levels actually have to be. How much would it cost to run, say, a biomass plant in Kakamega, or how much would it cost to run a solar farm in Arusha, or whatever else? Relate that to what price you can offer for electricity, and then by understanding people's demand, people that haven't had electricity before, this is where the science comes in, the things I'm working on, what their demand pattern actually looks like when they first get access to electricity, how much they're willing to pay, and so on, what kinds of things they're replacing. These are the things I'm working on. I'd love to talk to you more about it. Still contacts up here. We can try and exchange information, but it's a very, very interesting area, and this is the thing I'm most passionate about when working on energy and electricity here, because it's got more of a kind of a longer term foundation. I'm not trying to build a business in 1 year, I'm trying to build an industry in 5 or 10. So how do we enable that industry, private providers for electrification in rural places, how do we enable that to break out and grow, and then grow beyond any kind of scale that IBM can imagine, which is what we're after. Thanks.
Hi, my name is John. Mine is more or less a comment.
Sure.
So there's a state in the US, I think it's Alabama, where they've worked so well on renewable energy that some factory plants have switched and started using that. And then the other day I saw a picture on Twitter where a city in China, the whole city have rooftops with solar panels. I mean, so clearly in Kenya, the problem is not sun. I mean, so the question is, why isn't it happening? Why don't we have that whole sort of scale of moving into the renewable energy? And then, what else? Google, I mean, the cars that run on solar. So they've done that in Europe, and the only obstacle is that they do not have enough sun to keep the car on the road.
Yep.
So why don't we have that? We have the sun. Why
Sure.
don't we have those cars with us?
Great question.
Finally, an encouragement to entrepreneurs in the house. I mean, I've done a bit of business, and one of the things you don't do is don't start counting all the obstacles. I mean, there's legal obstacles.
Yep.
Get into it. The obstacles will get you along the way. So if you sit down and reflect about police is going to clamp down on me, I won't have partners, I won't do this. Get into it, then obstacles will always get you. Getting past them is what's the difficult bit.
Yeah, it's a great comment at the end, and that comes back to, you're going to fail many, many times before you actually succeed. So get there, fail as quickly as you can, because it's get busy living or get busy dying, right? So that said, to answer your questions about why solar isn't bigger in Kenya, this goes back to the question from over here. Policy matters quite a bit too. It's not just the sun. Two Septembers ago or 2 Octobers ago, a VAT went in place 16% on most goods that a lot of them had exceptions before. Solar equipment was one of them, and it actually really damages the industry. The country that has the most deployed solar panels on roofs right now is Germany. Germany is not very sunny. It's really, really, really cloudy and not sunny at all. If you looked at just the economics of how much energy they're offsetting by putting in these solar panels relative to doing other things like wind or whatever else, it doesn't make a lick of sense. Why would they do it? They're doing it because they wanted to build their industry. China's the same way. They wanted to build their industry, and they're exporting to places like Kenya, like the US, like other places all across the world. So that's government getting behind that technology. So that's a big part of it as well. And also, solar isn't just about the panel, which has come down immensely in price, a lot to do with Chinese manufacturing. But there's a lot of other things in the ecosystem as well. And this is another thing to be aware of. I know there's a professor at Strathmore named Isabel da Silva who works on how to build a community of solar installers, the people that can professionally install these things and that they're trained and they have certification. Really, really critical part of the ecosystem that's being ignored. You need that. You need installation costs otherwise. You need inverters to switch from the DC that comes off of panels to AC to feed the electricity into our buildings. There's a lot of different pieces there. And if you start kind of honing in on some of the examples there, it could be one thing that you can work on that actually enables that. It could be figuring out how best to source inverters, or it could be how best to manage that electricity using an app or something else. So there's a lot of different opportunities that you have to really drill down to understand, and this connects directly to your point about get in there, start building things, because you're not going to learn that that's the problem until you've built it, until you've struggled, until you've run into that problem that sinks the first business model or the second business model or the third business model. But it's a cycle. You got to be willing to fail to be able to succeed. And that's a lot about what doing a startup is about. Yeah.
My question was a ride actually on what he said. Is why don't we have, well, I guess there are a few, but why don't we have so many hybrid cars in Kenya? Why are we dying here with fuel costs while other people are driving hybrid cars and just go to the gas station once in a while to refuel?
It's a great question. So it's, it's again, there's policy elements. Certain governments have given fairly large subsidies to hybrids, so it makes them at least somewhat cost competitive. There's different characteristics of the market as well. If you knew that a hybrid car would cost you twice as much as a fuel car, would you buy it? Very small sector of the population nods their head yes. An even smaller sector of the population actually does it when it comes down to the choice. These guys who are doing the marketing and figuring out where to sell the cars, they understand these things. That's their job. And so there's a lot more to it than just saying, oh, it exists somewhere, we should have it here. There needs to be cost reductions. There needs to be understanding of it in local markets. Even looking at the deployment of electric vehicles in places across the world, it's still very minimal, and it's going to be minimal for a long time. It's going to be 2030, 2035, and the US will be still under 5% of the fleet of total cars will be electric. it's going to be a long transition. And so it's important to realize what are the contributors to that, because that is what drives how you choose the opportunities that you attack. And it's importation costs, it's subsidies that aren't given, it's cost of sourcing materials. If you wanted to build it locally, where are you going to get the rare earth metals for your lithium-ion battery? It's not clear that there's a cheap and useful source for that anywhere nearby that has effective transport and other things. So there's a lot of things that go into why these products aren't here. That's worth considering. But we can talk more about this one offline if you want to have some more thoughts on it. But it's a good question. Whoever gets the microphone can ask a question.
Hello, mine is a question on, as an entrepreneur, how do you, what kind of research should you do for you to get a business that is sustainable and it's flexible? Should you invest in one sector, or should you diversify what you invest in? An example is the Everready company, which is based in Nakuru. A long time ago, they used to have booming businesses, but right now the company recently discharged a large number of its workers, and it's collapsing like Webuye paper mills. The reason for that is because of rural electrification. Long time ago, there used to be no electricity in the villages, only like in Nairobi, but now with electricity going to the villages, people stop buying batteries. So how do you determine which sectors to invest and how you can be flexible in it so that you diversify? If they were not dealing with batteries only, maybe solar panels, they could be still relevant. How do you remain relevant in your market?
Great. So there's two elements here that I want to discuss. One is about the roles of startups versus larger companies. In a startup, you're inherently going to be labor limited, and you're going to be funds limited in many cases. Those constraints should force you to focus on one thing. If you go to a venture capitalist and say, I want to work in this industry, this industry, and this industry, they'll say, it's nice to meet you, and get out of my office. Because you can't possibly make a deep imprint in multiple industries as a startup. Now, you can have that as a growth pattern. Maybe the thing you build is applicable to multiple industries, but choose one that best fits your current thinking. And your thinking is going to change because you're going to learn more, you're going to experience more, you're going to get to know your customers more, whatever else. The market's going to change, those kinds of things. But do one thing really well. And if that thing is no longer the right thing to do, then you consider going to another thing. But diversifying too early is a great way to fail. No, it's a terrible way to fail. But it's a huge risk with startups. Now, when it comes to big companies and deciding how to diversify, that's a portfolio question, and it's something that it's about disruptive technology. So there's this idea of disruption where a currently not established technology has a higher growth in an innovation curve than a currently established technology. And being able to follow that disruption so that, it's not doing as well now. Maybe the steel mill isn't producing as much steel or whatever else, but there's inherent benefits that in 10 years, it's going to be the dominant architecture for a steel mill, whereas the kind of other architecture isn't improving as quickly. That's a very important idea to technological disruption of industries. So I'll give a little plug for IBM here because I actually think it's a fascinating company. It's the only 100-year-old technology company around. IBM's first product was a cheese slicer. And it's reinvented itself so many times. Innovating on counting machines that were like cash registers, and then memory for computers, and then mainframes, and then PCs for a little while. Then we gave up on that, and so on. And not all the transitions have been perfect or ideal. But it's important to understand that at some point, the thing that's made all your money is not going to be the thing that's going to continue to make all your money. And you've really got to explore those things that might not be efficient or optimal now, but they might be going forward. And so take Nokia or Microsoft. They're both fighting this battle now. Office and Windows is not going to be the platform of the future. in its current incarnation. Or the Nokia candy bar phone is not going to be the phone that everybody has. So unless they innovate elsewhere or figure out other areas or whatever else, they're going to get beaten, and they're going to go become what Kodak was to photography. And so for big companies, it's a very different decision about how to innovate because they can place bets in a lot of different areas. A startup can't. A startup can only place bet in one area at a time. They can switch more easily. It's a lot harder to switch when you're a big company. But so that's the benefit the startup has. But if you take on too many things as a startup, you're going to fail.
You touched on energy conservation and efficiency, and I liked the green ant example. Are there any hardware or software that can actually, in the client side, create that efficiency? Like, for example, maybe have a device that is in your house that can tell you, hey, you left the bathroom light on, and that's a surplus of energy.
That's what these guys are building, right? So part of it is that's the technology they've put in place, and they've identified that you can do it with, so it's a very similar business model to O-Power. O-Power has done it because the sensing's already there if they partner with the utility. Green Ant and ecois.me have done the same thing by putting a little sensor in place. And so study it. Maybe it's valuable here. Maybe there's something different about it here that might make it actually a viable business. It's not really clear if businesses would be willing to pay for it, if customers would be willing to pay for it at the price points that you could offer it. But what they've done is they've probably taken a part off the shelf and adapted it slightly to their need hardware-wise, and they've probably built the software themselves and learned about the machine learning, it's a field that's called non-intrusive load monitoring, that you have one measurement at a higher level in the stream and use it to discern what's happening lower in the tree when power is being used by lights or computers or blenders or whatever else. So these are the things that there are potential models there that might actually work here. So it's the fun of investigation. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so Dr. Ndemo mentions the Internet of Things. The sensor that they're putting on the electricity meter, it's going to be connected. It's going to be connected to the internet likely. So that's an example of an Internet of Things innovation that is enabling an entirely new kind of business model. It's finding that in wearables. It's finding that in how you connect to your phone. It's finding that in how you do transport or in healthcare or in education or whatever else. There's lots of potential. This is one of the better times to ever be an entrepreneur because there's just so many options out there, and it's way easier now than it was, a generation ago, back when I was still alive. All right, two more questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why is renewable energy so expensive? Like biogas is very amazing, and so is solar. But the cost is very high. And how can we use technology to help bring down the costs?
It's a good question. So it's important to understand what contributes to those costs. Is it fuel costs? Is it business operations? Is it input of equipment? Is it importation fees? Is it transport costs? It's a lot of things that contribute to it. And you might find a nugget that tells you something really, really interesting that, hey, maybe it makes sense to build those digesters locally if I can find the right inputs to the system. So that's an investigation piece. I think when it comes to solar, the cost has come down, but there's still an importation fee issue. There's a transport issue that's important there. And manufacturing. A lot of the manufacturing doesn't happen here. It happens in China where it's a lot cheaper and they already have a lot of facilities to do that. So that's an important consideration as well. When it comes to biomass, biogas, maybe it's the price of the fuel might be a little too expensive in certain places. It depends on where you are. Price of transporting fuel to the digester, maybe it's the cost of the materials to build the digester. Maybe it's not finding the right balance between amount of fuel versus amount of energy produced, or not finding the right customers. There's a lot of things to explore there, and there's a lot of companies trying to do that, but there's all sorts of ways to use IT to help that come across, whether it's in payments or monitoring for, with sensors for optimization or other things. There's lots of potential to work out there, especially when you can follow the trends forward and see the prices of these things are going to come down when scale happens. That's a good industry to be in because market forces are on your side, and other people aren't noticing those things now because they're looking at the current prices and thinking, oh, this is not a tenable business, when you're much better off looking at the future prices. So you get to invent the future rather than just predict it. Whoever gets the mic, right here, I guess.
Hi, my name is Steve. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, I think as entrepreneurs and investors, there's no longer an excuse of not investing in clean energy because actually our world is dying because of using fossil fuels. So initially people are having an excuse that you cannot run a solar industry or a solar plant for 24/7, but actually right now it's possible because like in Germany right now, they can store the energy in form of heat. They produce like twice amount of electricity, and then they store the other one in terms of heat, thermal tanks, so that during the night they use that heat to heat water. So that means solar energy plant is also competitive like fossils. Mm-hmm. So we have no excuse but to invest in that, or else maybe the future of this earth won't be that good. Yep. And then the question is, I don't know how Kenya is, but actually when you walk around with our friends, mostly in Nairobi, you find the garbage or waste in form of plastics, maybe papers, let's say municipal waste. But you find a country like Norway, they are changing municipal waste into energy so good that they import waste from other countries that they get paid. So what is your take on this in Kenya? Can Kenya also achieve 100% efficiency in waste to energy so that we can even import? Because when we import, let's say from Uganda, they'll pay us for eradicating their waste. Yep. So what's your take on that?
That's a great comment and a question that are very interconnected. So I want to address the question first, which is about waste to energy. So there's been a lot of excitement lately about different businesses that do this. One of the big challenges when it comes to waste collection is logistics. How do you collect from all these places? How much does it cost? How much time does it take? Whatever else that are connected to getting your supply to your digester or whatever your incinerator is, or so on. And so IT can really help with logistics. So that's a very, very interesting opportunity, and there's a lot of potential there. Another thing that's really important is in waste processing like this, there's a huge amount of labor involved in sorting and processing. Labor is fairly cheap here, so that's something that is a consideration in how you would design a business in this space. Now, I think it's a great area to work in. I think there's potential in solid waste. I think there's potential in animal waste. I think there's potential in human waste. And there's companies I've seen that are popping up in all of these places. It's important to understand the science. So, for example, in animal waste, there's a lot more energy stored in it because their digestive systems aren't as efficient as a human digestive system is. So there's a lot more energy in animal waste than there is in human waste. But there's still ways to make this work. There's a company, Sanergy, that works in Mukuru in the industrial area that is putting up toilets. The toilets are run as franchises, and they go about every day and collect all the waste from these toilets. They process it, make it safe, and they make it into fertilizer. And it's organic fertilizer, really high quality. It's safe. And it's an innovative idea that, the challenge for them is getting the density of that waste. So they operate in a slum where there's, so much supply, and as long as they can do that collection, it makes sense. Now, in solid waste, you could think about different ways that you can make this work. Maybe you go to Dandora or somewhere else that there's a huge agglomeration of these things. I'm sure they'd love to have you take the waste off of their hands. So there's lots of potential for ideas like that. It's worth looking into. And the second one is about the comment that you made, which is about climate change and how it's heating up the earth, and how we as entrepreneurs can kind of look into and address these kinds of things. It's important to be pragmatic as well as have a compass, a moral compass. So in my case, my moral compass is renewables are very important for us to be able to kind of continue as a race and as a society. I follow the science. I like to think I understand it. There's a lot of disinterest in people that don't necessarily have that compass, that are just pushing for money. What you really need is a virtuous pairing of when people can make money and follow their moral compass, because those are the things that pragmatically scale. And so there's a little bit of be the change that you want to see in the world, to try and achieve that kind of scale that makes solar or biomass or hybrid vehicles show up here, to really understand where they are. But at the same time, you very much have to be pragmatic. You can't necessarily cross things where culture is going to absolutely full stop prevent it from happening, or policies or whatever else. But there's opportunities, especially now with the rise of impact investing and the opportunities to take ingenuity and innovation and really deploy it at scale quite easily and at low cost. There are opportunities to start making dents in that problem right now, and to start to tear down the barriers that are on the problems we'd love to solve slowly in different ways, and have a million different people attacking it from different angles. You have to be able to play the long game and not the short game. And that's really thinking about the things I want to work on. How do they align with my passions? And you're going to do much better at things if you're passionate about it. So that's the answer I would give, is really the idea about waste to energy is a great one, and it accomplishes all the things your comment brings out, and that's something to investigate. So thanks.
Thank you very much. I think that's the last of our questions. What I'd encourage you is to follow up with Jay. Jay, he's actually Dr. Jay. He's pretty... How many of us want to be professors and doctors before 40, if you are like in that age range? Cool stuff. Anyway, but it is a pleasure to host you, Jay, and I think there were a lot of insights on the pitfalls, opportunities, and how we as industry players, both from as well as government and the entrepreneurship world, how we can actually tap into, and just how this ecosystem plugs in, how the iHub, IBM Research Lab, experts like Dr. Ndemo and alike can plug into this ecosystem and enrich it from an entrepreneurial side, and how we can actually get the consumers out there. We can kind of like meet this demand-supply issue that's going on right now. There's a lot of demand for solutions in energy, in water, in health. You mentioned the 6 areas that you're focusing on. And you can see a lot of work is being done by the research lab and other stakeholders around Kenya to actually address this demand area. So as Jay said, and as I hear Dr. Ndemo is Professor Ndemo, he's going to tell us a little more about that later. It's a gradual process, but we are here to actually like help entrepreneurs like you at these forums, give you insights on how you can actually tap into these opportunities. Thank you very much, Jay.
Yeah, thank you all very much. It was my pleasure to be here.
No more questions. Thank you. Later, you can speak with Jay. I'd just like to highlight something about Dr. Ndemo, which is key. And I see there's a full house here at iHub, and it's very inspiring to see this, right? Dr. Ndemo has been a pioneer, champion for tech and ICT in Kenya. I hope you all know that, right? Yes. When I first met Dr. Ndemo, my background is in computer science. I studied at the University of Nairobi. And the following year, in 2008, we held a first Facebook developer garage. And that's a forum, a very similar forum that I had met Dr. Ndemo. And he talked about something very intriguing. And I like that paradigm of thinking, because he said that we should think of problems as opportunities. And he gave the example of an entrepreneur in the rural area that was sitting in a kiosk, and then at that time, 2008, mobile phones were already out there. We had the basic feature phones, the Nokias that Jay showed earlier on. And this entrepreneur was tapping into the problems whereby people could not have like enough charge for their phones. So he would charge 10 shillings for every hour. And this is the simple entrepreneurship opportunities that we can look at. And I encourage you to look at the negatives into positives and turn them into opportunities. The very simple things are the basic opportunities that you can tap into. And just to summarize this whole forum, we kind of like doubled into one. We doubled what we call a Negawatt meetup with the Entrepreneurship Forum, and the first session was on energy. And Jay spoke about what Negawatt is about and what we're doing about it in the next few months. But I just wanted to give a highlight that Negawatt is this global competition that's been run by the World Bank. It's a global platform to encourage communities within cities to innovate solutions around energy, and specifically energy efficiency. So there are 4 different cities, and those cities are Nairobi, Accra, Dar es Salaam, and Rio de Janeiro. And we're using a multi-tiered approach, 5-phase approach, whereby we're using meetups such as this. This is the first kind of meetup. Then we're actually in conjunction with our Nairobi partners. iHub is one of the main implementing partners, together with IBIS Africa at Strathmore, and Bernard, who actually runs IBIS Africa, is here from Strathmore. We all have a key role in each stage of the Negawatt global competition from a Nairobi perspective, whereby the meetups happen here at the iHub. From here, we'll actually have a more narrowed down meetup later in the next few months. So check out our blog, check out our Twitter, Facebook, networks for more information. But we'll have a more condensed meetup and what you call a design challenge, whereby we take the general information, as you said. Now we're going to filter with experts. I hear there are a lot of energy entrepreneurs in this forum. You will be at that design thinking workshop, or what we call a challenge definition day. And those challenge definition days will be fed into what we called a Negawatt bootcamp weekend, or a Negawatt Bernard, Negawatt weekend, yeah, whereby it's going to be the 36-hour to 48-hour, probably 36 hours at max, whereby we take the challenge definitions and we prototype them. And that's where it addresses your challenges of like, how do we meet industry experts? They're going to be experts and judges and mentors at this forum. iLab and IBIS together with iHub will be hosting that, and we'll invite experts like Jay and a few other people to be your mentors and judges. And then from there, that's not the next stage. As Jay said, you need to get an idea, you need to get a concept, but you need the validation. So the validation is going to be the weekend, but you also need to actually validate your idea to actually get it into the growth stage. So IBIS and iLab are actually going to have a 4-week acceleration program on what you need to improve. So as Jay mentioned, like all the opportunities, you learn, you measure, and then you evaluate. There are going to be different kinds of methodologies, from Steve Blank to Eric Rice, different methodologies that will be used during the 4-week acceleration. And then all this will condense into what we call a demo day, which will be around April or May. So look out for those. Look forward to updates, or like the social media networks, a blog, and on IB's iHub website and social media networks. And without further ado, we come to an end for very first Entrepreneurship Forum for 2015. I didn't introduce myself earlier on because that's the whole idea. You come and network, you get to know who I am. But for those who'd like to know, my name is Jessica Colasso, and I am the Director of Partnerships at the iHub. But I also call myself, when I first met Dr. Ndemo, I used to call myself a mobile tech evangelist because mobile was booming. But I recoined that definition to what we call a mobile and robotics bootcamp evangelist. You heard Internet of Things, you've heard hardware, you heard wearables. So I go with the trends and just change my personal brand as the trends grow. So I'm more than welcome to talk to you about what the iHub is. We're here to help people like you get to the next level. We connect people. We like to catalyze the growth of the Kenyan tech community. We want to support startups. We want to give you the relevant information that you do need to get you to the next stage. All right? And I'd like to invite Dr. Ndemo. Sorry, actually, correction, Professor Ndemo. It sounds awesome, right? yeah, Professor Ndemo to actually give the closing remarks and just tell us when the next Entrepreneurship Forum will be.
Thank you. I think we should give a political clap to Jay. Nasema ile moja, mbili, tatu, funga, fungua. Okay. You should have closed when I said funga. It is. So I think we are very happy that the Megawatt Challenge has been launched. And what I will say here, if you have any problem and you need support, Jessica has said what is going to happen. You can call me anytime. If you want people to think through, most of these analog professors know the problem. They would come and tell you, then you know what to code. This is the bridge that we want to provide, such that Kenya must win this. Why do you look sad? We must win this. Let me see the energy in your face. Thank you. Next Entrepreneur Forum will be on February 28th. And we are going to focus on water and water apps and other things. Then in March, we want to look at the issues around hardware. Hardware has become a serious problem in this country, a serious problem. I'm trying to work with some content developers, and they now have reached a point that we must find a local solution for hardware. We will deal with it in March. So 28th of February, we'll deal with water, and March we'll deal with hardware. Then from March, then we can announce other dates. And this year, we are going to do things much more differently than we did in the previous year. As Jessica said, while you were away for Christmas, I became professor. So nobody was And Jessica thought my wife was around so that she can say that I'm a big man. She was not around. Can I give you her phone number so that women don't think that we are big, and until somebody else says, this guy is real cool, you know. So I have nothing much to say, but congratulate you for coming, and let's work together to see that we put our country on the map. Asante. Thank you.